The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, Lords. Second reading.
The reasoned amendment in the name of Andrew Griffith has been selected. Minister to move the second reading.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Why not? Of course, why not?
Desmond Swain.
When did weights and measures become metrology? And is this use of newspeak deliberately to cover the Orwellian attempt to cloak this huge grab for power, and to what end?
Well, I am grateful for that intervention very early on in proceedings. I cannot provide a definitive answer to the honourable gentleman. This is the naming of this bill, but I promise I will find that out and put it to him in writing. But he will know that this bill, originally planned, I believe, by the previous government because of the need to repatriate powers to the United Kingdom as a result of our exit from the European Union, is something that we need in terms of the toolkit that we can provide. So far from being Orwellian, it's a pragmatic, practical proposal, and I look forward now to making the case in more detail for it. Madam Deputy Speaker, the primary mission of this government and the driving force of my department is stronger economic growth. And not just growth that looks good on paper, but growth that's seen and is felt on our high streets in our towns and cities and in the communities that we serve, that reverses the 15 years of stagnation with all the negative consequences that we all felt during that time. And to do that, we need an economy in which shops and small businesses can compete on a more level playing field with online marketplaces and with the big tech giants. And we need an economy which promotes investment and innovation, but at the same time ensures consumers and businesses have real modern-day protections. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill is a small but hugely important piece of legislation. And it is one which will further cement the UK's status as a world leader in product regulation and safety. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my right honourable friend very much for giving way. He's making an important introduction to today's bill, but I wonder if he agrees with me about the importance of international alignment in the standards that we are discussing today on scientific matters as being essential for the smooth operation of modern advanced manufacturing.
Minister.
Hugely grateful to my honourable friend, and I believe I'm correct in saying he's not only a metrologist himself, but the first metrologist elected to Parliament. So I put no heavy expectation management on his speech today, but we will all be looking forward to it with some interest. And he is right to say there are areas where we will choose to work with international standards, there'll be areas where we choose to diverge, but that decision is only enabled by having the powers to begin with. So no decisions are made in this bill if it becomes an act of Parliament as to how we will do that. But without that, we wouldn't have the toolkit to make these decisions. So the essence of these proposed laws are taking back control to the House of Commons and to Parliament itself to make these kinds of decisions. Of course, I'll give way to the Honourable.
He'll be aware, I'm very grateful for giving way, he'll be aware from the second reading debate in the Lords that a number of, shall we gently say, Eurosceptic peers expressed concern that what this bill was doing was a form of dynamic alignment with the European Union, which means that far from taking back control about what standards were involved and what guidelines were necessary, we would be abdicating it to whatever the European Union decided. Can he set our minds at rest about that? I'm sure he wouldn't wish to be diverted along such a dead-end route.
Minister.
Well, I am extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman who always brings wisdom to these debates, and I can give him that assurance absolutely. This bill provides no decision as to how we should use these powers, but the reason we are putting it forward today is the same reason the previous Conservative government first proposed a bill of this kind, which is that having left the European Union, we need the powers to properly regulate these products in this way. And without this, we wouldn't necessarily have the ability to do that. Of course, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
on that specific note, further to my right honourable friend's remark, that means then, presumably, the government will press for recognition of UK standards where they prevail and where we think we're doing the job better. So there will be absolutely occasion where we can learn from others and others where they can learn from us. So is that the government's intention, and will he make that clear now?
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to make that, and we see that in a number of areas. I think that is the case when it comes to the whole field of regulation, where, for instance, given how topical AI is right now, I think we've chosen a different regulatory path in the UK to the European Union. I think that is to our economic advantage, because I'm very confident in the approach that we are taking, and I'm sure when I get to the provisions of this bill, when it comes to particularly weights and measures, the whole House will be united in, at this occasion, being able to say we believe that it's traditional British standards that are particularly important to us. But I say again, having the powers to set standards in itself makes no decision as to how they are used. We can all clearly recognise the need to repatriate these powers to our own statute book. And I was going to make a little progress, but I can't resist the honourable gentleman.
Smith.
You want to raise a major point, just a small point. And I was doing some work on this for a previous government, looking at what we could do on leaving the EU in terms of our regulations and standards. It became apparent to me that the UK is behind only America and China globally in setting standards for the rest of the world. So I wonder what degree does he think he's planning to enhance that rather than return to any European usage of standards when we already dominate the field?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman will have heard me just say that our intention in this area is to cement the UK status as a world leader in product regulation and safety. I think we would all recognise the tremendous, not only consumer but business benefits that come from being a jurisdiction where our consumer protections are widely recognised, where people have confidence in the goods and services that they buy being to the highest standard possible. But where we see gaps in our provision because of the substantial change that has occurred from leaving the European Union, surely we would want to see those gaps filled so as we're not in a position to not be able to continue our success in this area. Of course, I'll give way finally to the honourable gentleman.
Wilson.
He gives assurances to the House that the idea is not to take us back into EU laws and have EU laws imposed on the United Kingdom, and yet the bill heavily references EU laws. How does he explain that?
Minister.
I can explain that very clearly, and colleagues who have been interested in this will have followed the proceedings in the other place, such as discussions in this area. I put the case very straightforwardly. We do not have the ability, without this bill, to regulate product standards in a whole range of areas. There are some cases where there will be a strong consumer or business demand for alignment in some places with other jurisdictions. There'll be places where we wish to make a decision to diverge because we see that as being in our economic interests. But surely we all accept a position where we cannot have a position where we don't have the ability to regulate key products, particularly new products that have come from the new technology that's available and the opportunities that come from that. And I do say politely again to anyone on the other side who's not quite reassured by that, the previous government, the Conservative government, was planning an exact similar bill in order to fill this gap in the statute book.
My honourable friend give way on that?
I will give way to my honourable friend on that.
Stringer.
I'm grateful for that. I mean, I'd like to make 2 points. The first is this House can do what it wants. It doesn't need this bill in order to regulate anything. That just simply isn't true. But on the point of whether this will lead to dynamic realignment with the EU, can you explain then what Clause 27A is for? Because it seems to me that that is a clause that could be used to dynamically realign with the EU regulations.
Minister.
Give me one, yes. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman on that point.
And he owes me now. He owes me, by the way, Madam Speaker. The key thing here is we mustn't use EU standards as a default. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. We have the authority here to make our own standards. We often do very well. But the risk is that when we haven't yet done that, the EU standards will become the default position. Now, he can be very clear with us today and make absolutely crystal clear that that's not the case.
Minister.
As ever, particularly grateful to him for his courtesy, and I'll reply to my honourable friend and say, reading Clause 7A very clearly, product regulations may may provide that a product requirement is to be treated as met if. So again, I say, there will be times where our economic interest is in a close relationship with the product standards in, for instance, the European Union or another jurisdiction. There will be times when it is not, but it is our choice in order to do that. And I think we would all recognise the absence of powers without this bill taking place. Finally, one more time, then I'll perhaps articulate the bill.
Grateful for the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He makes reference to the ability of this House to make regulations. Well, we can, of course, in this House by primary legislation. And there was a parliamentarian who said this, and I quote, "The use of delegated powers comes a risk of abuse by the executive, which is not something the opposition would ever support." Now, he may agree with that, but he should do, because he said it.
Minister.
That was obviously part of a very wise set of remarks I gave in the dispatch box. But yes, lest we recognise, and I would say again, because this has been through the other place, there have been changes the government has made as a result of that feedback. We have removed a number of Henry VIII powers. We've introduced a consultation requirement. We provided for additional affirmative resolution procedures, and we've also said we'll publish a code of conduct that sets out the statutory and non-statutory controls to ensure regulation is proportionate and evidence-based and developed through consultation. So because of the process we have been through, we've responded to the kind of concerns I was wisely articulating in relation to primary legislation, and perhaps it would be of use to the House if I say a little bit about that journey and the work of the other place in that regard, because I do want to thank in particular my ministerial colleague Lord Leong for his great efforts in taking the bill through the other place. I also want to thank the many members and committees of the other House for their assistance in creating what I believe is strong and effective legislation which will benefit millions of UK businesses, tens of millions of consumers, and of course all those who enjoy a pint or two at the pub. Give way on that point.
The Minister. He's right to praise the House of Lords for making sure that the Great British Pint is on the face of this bill as an exclusion from the metrology regulations. However, this will not satisfy metric martyrs. For the Minister will remember that the ability to sell in imperial measures was a big issue a few years ago. Why is it that there's an elaborate schedule to the product regulations but not to metrology, and why in particular is food generically not included in the exemptions from what the Minister proposes to do?
Minister.
Well, we would say with confidence there was never a danger to the pint, but because of the concerns that were raised in the other place and by perhaps some colleagues here, I'm more than happy to have made the changes to assure everyone present and everyone watching this that the pint will be defended and secured on the face of this bill. In relation to imperial measurements, I have to say I received no entreaties from business that they wish to sell in imperial measurements, but if the honourable gentleman believes there is an absence of provisions in the bill, he can write to me, I'll write back to him, and hopefully again be able to reassure him. But I think he may be misplaced in thinking that is a principal significant issue for UK businesses. Madam Deputy Speaker, as all honourable members know, the digital age we live in is one that has created significant growth opportunities. And the consumer and technology landscapes we have today are almost unrecognisable from 20 or 30 years ago. And so the products we buy and the way in which we buy them are also evolving rapidly. Now that means the relevant rules and regulations must adapt to. And if we're to protect consumers and businesses, especially smaller firms, that is essential. Now, as I believe we've already examined in quite some detail, product regulation and metrology are policy areas that have largely been repatriated from the EU following our withdrawal in 2021. Since then, the UK government has simply not had the necessary powers to continue regulating these areas effectively. And that is why we have brought forward this legislation, so we can respond to anticipated changes in the global regulatory landscape. And that is why, to be frank, I'm somewhat bemused by the reasoned amendments put forward today. This bill will ensure the UK is better placed to address modern-day safety issues. It gives us the power to better regulate things like potentially dangerous baby sleep products and toys. It will enable us to reduce burdens on business and keep up with technological developments, for example, by updating the outdoor noise regulations in Great Britain. Now, this will align testing methods across the UK as overwhelmingly supported by our recent call for evidence, and it will protect the public from noise pollution from products like lawnmowers and power generators. I'll give way on that point.
Grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. I've only closely scrutinised the bill today, so I'm bringing myself up to date on this. But it appears to give the Secretary of State the power to ban any product he wishes, for whatever reason. And we make law in this place, not because when we're dealing with a minister of the calibre and moral calibre of the right honourable gentleman, but on the basis that we might have someone who lacks those qualities. That's who we legislate for. But is it true that this bill would give the Secretary of State the power to ban literally any product, and all that would have to be done is to notify this House?
Well, I'm grateful to him for his concern and his regard. I believe if we were of the view that a product was a danger to the public, the Honourable Gentleman would expect me as the Secretary of State and my department to take action. Now, if he is concerned about the provisions in this bill, he can look to the changes that have been made. It's been through an extensive scrutiny process in the other place, particularly in relation to the powers and the delegated powers given to the Secretary of State. But I think he recognises the case that we are making, both for the safety of the public and indeed why members on that side of the House themselves recognise the need for a bill of this kind. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill will also help create a level playing field between the high street and online marketplaces. Critically, we are able to protect consumers by reducing the number of unsafe and non-compliant goods that are sold online. Now, this could include asking sites to verify third-party sellers before allowing them to list their goods, or having a product safety reporting function for customers on their sites. One example of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, are e-scooters and e-bikes, which, like many products, are reliant on lithium-ion batteries. These batteries have been attributed to a number of fires in recent years, both in households and on public transport. Now, whilst we know that the vast majority of products are safe, in recent years we have seen some goods missold by a minority of unscrupulous manufacturers and sellers. As a result, low-standard, high-risk products have been able to enter the UK market. Some people have paid for this with their homes and, in some cases, their lives. And I think we'd all recognise that is unconscionable. I want to pay tribute, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the family of Sophia Duarte. Sophia tragically died when a bicycle, which had been converted into an e-bike, burst into flames. The bike's lithium battery pack failed, causing a fire on New Year's Day 2023. I know the whole House will join me in recognising the bravery and courage of Sophia's family in campaigning for change in memory of their daughter, and in fighting for better regulation of e-bikes, along with the batteries and chargers associated with them. I would also like to thank the London Fire Brigade for their campaigning on this issue in recent years. They've been on the front line, seeing firsthand the devastation that has been wrought by some of these products. And this is what this bill is about: keeping the public safe. The Office for Product Safety and Standards have taken action in this area already. They've issued 26 withdrawal notices on 8 online marketplaces, on 2 manufacturers and 16 sellers. This has removed 2 dangerous models of e-bike battery from sale, and I'm glad that the legislation we're discussing today will allow us to consider further steps on enforcement. Do the Honourable Gentleman wish to come in?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I've been campaigning for greater regulation on bicycles anyway, who have got away with killing individuals, not least the e-bikes as well. But so I want to just pick him up on this particular point. I don't disagree with him on the need for regulation, and it should have been done some time ago. So we are as at one on that. What I still don't think he has quite answered the question that was posed to him by his honourable friend and by my honourable friend just now, is why do we need to have a wide-sweeping bill like this if we could do it already in the House by vote? So the key thing is, if you have an argument that is powerful enough to say to them, this must be done, then both houses will see that through very quickly by the power of persuasion, but with the right to vote on it or disagree. This takes that away and achieves the same result, but only by in a way of a sort of diktat by who is ever in power. And I agree with him when he was in opposition, by the way.
Well, I'm sorry we have not convinced the Honourable Gentleman, but I am convinced that the government needs powers in this area, that we need to be able to respond to fast-moving changes in technology and in regulation, and that to keep the public safe, they would expect me as Secretary of State, my department, and indeed the government to have these powers. So perhaps we haven't convinced him at this stage, but if he looks at the proceedings in the other place, if he looks at the stages we'll have at committee stage, I will give way one more time before we get on to the Lord's amendment.
I'm very grateful, I'm genuinely grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman. He says he's failed to persuade us in this place, but does he accept that he also failed to persuade the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee, chaired by Labour in the other place, where they said just last month, "We remain of the view," and this is a quote, "the delegation to ministers of lawmaking powers in this bill involves legislative power shifting to an unacceptable extent from the legislature to the executive." Why is it, does he think, that they remain against his view?
I find when political parties go into opposition, all of a sudden they seem less keen on the government having decisive powers to take action in a whole range of areas. But look, I have already said we have listened very carefully to the criticism from the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee. There are significant changes to the legislation before us today, which I'm happy to take him through, but they do relate to the number of Henry VIII powers, they do relate to the consultation requirement, they do relate to the additional affirmative resolution procedures. So, of course, we're always seeking feedback. I'll go through now some of the other amendments made in the other place, but I believe the processes that we have around this, is it going to be good? That's the question I always have for the Honourable Gentleman. I'll give way one more time to it.
It'll be brief. Forget the Delegated Regulation Committee. What about his colleague Lord Lyon? He said in the House of Lords he didn't think that this was right. So what way does it need to be improved? And is he going to look very carefully at the extent of these powers? Because it's, even from this short debate, it's clear how wide-ranging and over-the-top they are.
Secretary of State.
Well, I would say to the Honourable Gentleman that this second reading, we have a bill which is even stronger than the one which originally started in the other House. And I would once again thank all of our colleagues in the other place for their constructive feedback and their contributions to this debate. I won't go through every change that was made for honourable and right honourable members here, but I will just mention some aspects of the bill that have been strengthened. Firstly, we have amended the bill to ensure there is more parliamentary scrutiny. And we have provided for a statutory consultation requirement to ensure that regulations are informed by those who would be impacted by them. There will also be that additional use of the affirmative procedure for regulations stemming from the bill. Secondly, the bill now includes a requirement for me, as the Secretary of State, to publish a statement setting out how my department expects to identify and assess high-risk products. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, contrary to previous suggestions from the party opposite, the Great British Pint will clearly not be affected by this legislation, whether that is ale, cider, or indeed a pint of milk. We do not believe that the bill in its original form posed any threat to the pint, but we don't want to run the risk of colleagues thinking that my reassurances are small beer. So we have accepted an amendment tabled in the other place, which will give the pint statutory protection. Which means, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a few weeks' time, when I hope you confirm to the House that the bill has received royal assent, we can all raise a pint protected under statute to this bill. And I did inquire, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I was allowed to bring a pint in here with me to illustrate the point, which apparently is not in order, as only the Chancellor has that ability. Perhaps something we will look at, given the week I've had and I'm having right now, but perhaps we will get to that at a later date. To summarise, Madam Deputy Speaker, this legislation will finally enable the government to properly regulate in areas where we have been unable to do so post-Brexit. And it also gives us the tools we need to better regulate modern-day consumer products. This bill will help create a fairer environment for high street shops and small businesses. It supports our growth mission, and it will be better protection for millions of consumers. For all these reasons, Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Shadow Secretary of State Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too often when the public think of Parliament, they think of out-of-touch power and bad laws. This bill today is the archetype of everything that is wrong with Westminster. There should be an unwritten rule in this postcode: never trust a bill with a convoluted name, and this bill is no exception. Whilst professing to simplify our regulatory framework, the reality is this is an EU Trojan horse of a bill which will sabotage our Brexit freedoms, undermine the integrity of the United Kingdom, disrespect Parliament, befuddle British business with uncertainty and take us back to being a Brussels rule taker, all from a party who voted 48 times to overturn the will of the British people. But before I I won't give way. Before I get into further, I'm going to say something nice. I'm going to say something nice about the honourable gentleman in a minute. Before I get into detail, let me welcome the government's U-turn on their plan to scrap the Great British Pint. Let us hope that that's the first of many. When I raised this on the 26th of February, Labour members described it as a conspiracy theory. The honourable member for St Albans said it was scaremongering, and the government front bench said an amendment was no more needed than a law to say that the sun would rise in the morning. The truth is, the government were caught red-handed trying to ditch our British pint by this backdoor bill. Had we, on these benches, not fought back, the power to crush the British pint would have rested on the whim of a minister's pen. And welcome though this U-turn is, let us not ignore the fact that the Labour government wanted to give themselves this power in the first place. I'll give way to the gentleman there.
Turner.
I thank him for giving way, and I hope that he gives way also to my right honourable friend on the front bench. I just wonder if he could tell the House what possible motive he thinks a Labour government would have for scrapping the pint.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, the Labour motive is all too plain to see, because this is a Labour Party that voted 48 times to reject the will of the British people, led by the Prime Minister, who sought a second referendum to overturn the will. I accept that the honourable gentleman wasn't perhaps in this House at the time, but he might want to spend some time with his colleagues in the tea room and hear precisely what happened. Now, I'm going to make some progress. Madam Deputy Speaker, the anti-pub, anti-hospitality agenda goes far beyond this bill. The jobs tax, the threshold change, the attack on seasonal and flexible working, business rates more than doubled, the war on pub banter, and the garden smoking ban, all from this government. Our hospitality industry, for which the Secretary of State is smirking, deserves infinitely better than this from this government. I'm very happy to give way if he talks about what he's going to do to repeal the Employment Rights Bill.
Can I just ask him, he was a senior member of the previous government, played that well-known role in the mini-budget, for instance, and a number of government things. Will he just confirm that the previous government was planning the exact same piece of legislation because of that absence in the statute book?
Once again,
Andrew Griffith.
He's failed to engage on the key issue, which is British businesses. It's not funny, because British businesses are bleeding out now. Business confidence is at a record low, unemployment is rising, and all they've got to talk about is the past, not the current that they are delivering here today. Now, Madam Deputy I'll give way.
He was asked a question just now whether the previous government was likely to bring this legislation. Can I also set the record straight that had we done so, he would have voted against it?
Andrew Griffith.
Well, my honourable gentleman, my right honourable friend, has great wisdom on these matters. Let me move on. Madam Deputy Speaker, the biggest flaw of many in this bill is that, as honourable members for Blackley and Middleton and Beverley and Holderness have both identified, it hands too much power with too little accountability. There is a real need to consider the balance between primary and secondary legislation, which in recent years has weighed too heavily in favour of delegated powers. Excessive reliance on delegated powers, Henry VIII clauses, or skeleton legislation such as this upsets the proper balance between Parliament and the executive. These are not my words, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the words of the Right Honourable Gentleman's Attorney General, taken from a speech he made in October, whilst in government, about the importance of restoring parliamentary sovereignty. And no one who considered that speech could fail to disagree. The Lords' Delegated Power and Regulatory Reform Committee have slammed it not once, not twice, but 3 times, including after the government changes to this bill. To put this into context, the powers contained, the wide powers contained in this 15-page bill, will allow ministers to unilaterally amend product safety regulation, impose obligations on online marketplaces, meddle with standards for weights and measures, or entirely align British regulatory standards with the European Union, posing a threat to the integrity of the UK internal market. It's 15 pages of the most egregious Whitehall overreach. I'll give way.
Does my honourable friend agree with me this is yet another hammer blow to British businesses? We've had the Labour Party introduce £25 billion of tax with the national insurance contribution for employers, £5 billion of cost with the workers' rights, a never-ending increase in energy bills as they drive forward on their net zero fantasy. And this is changing regulation more or less whimsically whenever they feel like to do it, destroying certainty and confidence for British businesses.
Well, my right honourable Fred makes a really, really serious and important point. I take at good faith the Secretary of State when he says that he desires for his government to grow the economy. Every government should, and I believe that this government should as well. But he must recognise that every single action he takes us further away from that goal, piling on the red tape, increasing the level of tax, and even the regulatory jeopardy in this bill of simply not knowing what product regulations will look like. How can any business plan for the future when the powers offered up by this bill introduce so much prospect of unpredictable regulatory change? I'll give way.
Kirsteen Jardine. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for giving way. But would he not agree with me that someone sitting at home watching this would be worried about the fact that what they hear is an argument that it's more important to stick to some anti-EU dogma than protect their children from dangerous products or keep dangerous electric bikes off the market and to regulate for their safety?
Griffith. With the very best will in the world, I think the Honourable Lady can do a great deal better than that. This House can legislate, as honourable members have said. This House can legislate. If there are dangerous products, bring those use cases here, and I believe across the House we will legislate rapidly to protect the safety of our constituents. But our constituents do not send us here with a 15-page bill full of skeleton powers to give the Secretary of State at the time unlimited ability to regulate without having to consult this place. Of course I'll give way.
Giving way. The challenge here for many of us who were here under the previous Parliament when he was in office and had powers to diverge is that we watched what happened and we watched the cost to British business, which is why his previous government in the end decided to abandon the British charter mark, did he not? Would he care to tell the House how much it would have cost British business had we proceeded with his plans? It was £1.6 billion, in case he doesn't know. British business needs to hear that we get it. They don't want more paperwork, they want less.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, I'm genuinely intrigued, and I shall sit here and listen to the Honourable Lady's speech later on. Does she want divergence? Does she want us to use our Brexit freedoms? Or does she seek to go back to being a rule taker and converge? Madam Deputy Speaker, we have not heard from the Secretary of State today a compelling argument as to why these powers should be granted. It is right that we in this House adopt the precautionary principle. And if the Secretary of State or the Minister in winding up can give us some more compelling use cases, then I'm sure we would consider that. Of course I'd give way.
This is all very important. There's been some merriment about the pint. But in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, the hero goes into a pub and somebody there laments the fact that the despotic regime has just abolished the pint and forced people to drink by litres. So the road to serfdom is paved by many steps like this.
Yes.
And by the way, when I was Minister for Consumer Affairs many years ago, we regularly banned things. We didn't need this bill.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes the perfect point that this is precisely what the road to serfdom looks like. Whether it's serfdom to an individual minister at a moment in time, or whether it's serfdom to an unelected Brussels bureaucratic elite. Why would we give up the powers of this House, the reason why we are sent here, and the ability to hold the government to account? And yes, please.
He's been very generous. He described this as a Trojan horse. I think he dignified it. It's more like a Trojan donkey. But would he agree with me that Clause 2, Para 7, is a particular problem? Because it appears to be taking as its baseline European Union regulations when it comes to determining safety. And that seems to many of us to be somewhat bizarre, the assumption that European Union regulation should be used as the starting point for any regulations that we might want to make regarding safety.
Griffith.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is exactly right, and the number of references, I'll give away, the number of references to the European Union throughout this, in contrast, for example, our biggest single country trading partner, the United States.
Secretary of State.
Really grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. I just want to answer that point directly with some clarification I've just sought in relation to my honourable friend. So clause 2(7)(a) is not about alignment, it is about recognition. So we already recognise certain EU product requirements on a mutual recognition basis, and where is the benefit to do so, that's what this clause allows. So it's not taking European standards as a basis for our own and aligning with them, but recognising where we have the interest to do that. That's what that power is specifically enabled to. So I'll write to him in detail if he wishes.
Shadow Secretary of State.
On behalf of my honourable friend, I'll thank the Secretary of State for intervening. It's important that we legislate with a full understanding of what the law says, but the point still stands in terms of the overweighting of references to EU standards versus comparable standards, for example, from the United States, from other Commonwealth friends of this great nation.
I'm extremely grateful. On that note, the point really is the one I made to the Secretary of State, that where, as the impact assessment suggests, regulation is moving at a pace, the Secretary of State repeated it, we will default to a European set of standards. That's the problem, and that's certainly implied in the impact assessment of the bill. I sought the Secretary of State's assurance that won't happen. If it doesn't happen, will there be no rules or regulations? How will that work in practice?
Griffith.
Well, we're having the proper debate and the interventions that perhaps we should have had when the Secretary of State himself was introducing the bill. But it does illustrate the point about putting into law a vast amount of ambiguity, even if it's well-intentioned and with the best of intentions today. Great ambiguity about how things will operate, and for a reason of which we know not. Because if there are particular instances, if there are e-scooters catching fire in people's halls, then this House has the ability to legislate, and legislate fast when necessary, against those particular harms at that particular moment in time. And I believe that my friend, with his many, many years of experience in this House, understands exactly that point. And I think that was what he was saying. Yes.
Would he accept that people on this side of the House can perhaps deliberately choose to believe that the words are ambiguous and the assurances given are ambiguous? But even the government's own members in the House of Lords believed that there was an ambiguity there. Because one of the comments made was the question of dynamic alignment with the EU remains unanswered, yet ever more topical. So even the government's own members believe there's an ambiguity there that needs to be cleared up.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, my honourable friend makes exactly the right point. This is a blank cheque bill. It's a Trojan horse bill, and it is simply not clear whether under this Secretary of State or any Secretary of State in the future, once these powers have been ceded by this place, as to how this will be implemented. And there is that real asymmetry between the constant litany of references to the European Union, a valued trading partner of ours, but only one valued trading of ours, as I hope the Secretary of State is about to reveal over the coming days. Because tomorrow we understand that tariffs will be imposed by the United States on British exporters. If that is the case, that would be the worst failure of trade policy for a generation. It is businesses, jobs, our economy who are all going to be paying the price. The Chancellor's emergency budget will not have lasted a single week because she made no provision for the imposition of tariffs, if that is indeed what is to come. And it is, frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, outrageous that the government have failed to make a statement. Despite the Prime Minister's official spokesman briefing the lobby, the Trade Secretary himself finding time this morning to conduct a round of media interviews, There is no statement from the government about where we are. If the Secretary of State would like to make a statement on the progress of US talks, I'll happily give way.
A little bit off topic from a second reading, but the Honourable Gentleman could have just listened to the Today programme this morning and would have heard me articulate those concerns. We are engaged with our US counterparts. We are engaged, I think more so than any other country, in those negotiations. He will know I will not share the content, the detail of those talks, but this is obviously a policy originating by the President of the United States that we are responding to and engaging with. But he will understand that comes from the mandate, from the agenda of the US administration.
Order. Can I just remind both the Secretary of State and the Shadow Secretary of State that we are on the second reading of Product Regulation and Metrology Bill and not necessarily tariffs.
Well, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I am nearly concluded in any case, but I do think the issue of product safety, the rules and regulations that govern our economy, as the Secretary of State himself say, is intrinsically linked with trade and the mutual recognition and the way in which you genuinely grow an economy by trying to remove trade frictions and trade barriers rather than erect them and subject our businesses to the tyranny of simply not understanding what the corpus of rules and regulations will be.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for making a powerful speech. Does he, like me, hope that the Liberal Democrats, on their hobby horse love of the EU, don't allow the EU flavouring of this bill to blind them to the frankly illiberal, executive enhancing, legislature diminishing aspects of this bill, and if they genuinely aspire to be His Majesty's opposition, they will join us this evening in voting against this second reading.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and I hope, and the Secretary of State slightly adhered to this in his own remarks about some of the ability of a country to make its own rules and regulations. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will soon be back in this House with a government statement at which we can celebrate the mother of all Brexit benefits from having secured the ability to conduct our own trade. And I look forward to hearing from the Liberal Democrats exactly how much they welcome for their constituents that ability. I'll give way.
Kirsteen Jardine.
Let me finish my sentence. Thank you very much. Although I can't speak immediately for all of the Liberal Democrats, it does puzzle us that the opposition doesn't seem to recognise that if they had legislated properly when we left the European Union, this legislation would not be necessary. So do they not accept any of the responsibility for where we are today?
Andrew Griffith.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be accepting any lessons from the Liberal Democrats about what it takes to Brexit successfully and to go back to being an independent nation. But if that is what the Honourable Lady is going to speak about, I look forward to hearing that. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is flawed in so many ways. Ministers, in the best will in the world, should not be bringing this bill here today, particularly given their failure to protect us so far from US tariffs. It's a bad bill from a government that is already failing, and it's a travesty for anyone who cares about respect for parliamentary democracy and the role of this House versus ministers. It is, as I've said, a Trojan horse bill that will sabotage our Brexit freedoms, will take us back to being an EU rule taker that the British people have long put behind us. And I urge the House to back our reasoned amendments later today and end this terrible bill.
Can I just confirm that the Shadow Secretary of State wishes to move his amendment formally?
Move formally.
The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed, as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Michael Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this bill. It is essential and it is timely. Upgrading our product safety regulation and metrology framework a word I will admit that I did have to look up, but doesn't take much to understand. This is delivering a much-needed boost to protections for consumers and ensuring that every company in the UK, whether they operate online or on our high streets, upholds the high product safety and quality standards that working people in this country deserve and has been absent for too long. Whether it's faulty carbon monoxide alarms, dangerous children's toys, or the issue of spontaneously combusting e-bikes and scooters that has been raised with me by my constituents in Worsley and Eccles, these are all examples of hazardous products being on sale, examples that are far too common. Clearly, there is an urgent need to raise the bar on consumer product safety in this country, and this bill achieves that aim, establishing a modern safety regime that will enable companies to operate safely whilst accounting for the post-Brexit regulatory landscape. Madam Deputy Speaker, in an increasingly turbulent international trading environment, it is imperative that the government update the UK's product regulations. However, since our exit from the EU, the government has not had the necessary powers to meet the challenges presented by the fast-moving global product safety standards environment. And this has left British consumers vulnerable to falling behind with regards to... I'll give way.
I'm interested in this argument. I mean, I've sat here for a little while and I've been on both sides of the House and I've sat in government. I have never come across a government that has failed to get regulation through when it feels it's necessary to do so, but that goes through with debate. We can't just impose regulations because one bit of us thinks it's right. There has to be some measure of whether it's balanced and whether it works. That's done by this House normally. Why give it to the government alone?
Michael Wheeler.
I think if the system that we had in place currently was working, we wouldn't be stood here debating this. We wouldn't see the shoddy products on sale. We would not have seen the fires. Basically, if the system worked, we would not be where we are. And the only explanation is either that the system doesn't or the last government failed in its duty to people in this country. Now, this, as I said, has left British consumers vulnerable to falling behind with regards to protections in emerging areas, rapidly emerging areas that need reaction of product safety, such as those related to new technologies like AI and lithium-ion batteries. I therefore support the bill's provisions to enable the government, to give the powers to the government to meet these fast-moving challenges of the day in these areas. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will give way.
Graham Stringer.
I'm interested that my honourable friend mentions AI. There are three major systems around the world being proposed for artificial intelligence regulations: Chinese, the EU and the United States. If we have to make a choice for our own framework, which might be different from those for the safety of people in industry, why should that not be done on the floor of this House rather than by delegated regulation? Because it is one of the most important issues that will face us in the coming years.
Michael Wheeler.
So I welcome that intervention, and I will happily admit to the House that I am not an expert on AI. I do, however, recognise that the fast-developing nature of AI, as it relates to consumer safety and product regulations, requires a rapid response, potentially not necessarily suited to a full debate on the floor of this House. Happily.
Honourable Gentleman, can you give a single instance of a seriously risky product which it was seen needed action, where a government at any time, the past decades, hasn't been able to act? Because I can't think of one.
I mean, I can think of several. They are on our streets. We look at the fires caused by e-bikes and e-scooters and the lack of regulation around them. We are in a fast-moving environment, and we are creating a framework that will future-proof our current system. Now, I'm sure I will happily give way.
I just want to help my honourable friend out because he wasn't here under the previous administration when the previous government introduced the retained EU law bill, which deleted over 4,000 laws and used statutory instruments to replace them. The member opposite, who was a minister at the time, is nodding his head as if that process was acceptable, but he's now challenging a colleague who wasn't here at the time to hear this goose and gander explanation that he's giving, that somehow it's not acceptable now, but it was acceptable then. So my honourable colleague is absolutely right to be concerned and slightly sceptical about the opposition's sudden agreement that statutory instruments are not perhaps the best way forward.
Yeah. Michael Wheeler.
And I am very grateful for that intervention, and I think what we are dealing with here is a regulatory black hole that has been left behind, an absence of a framework that is letting down the consumers and people of this country. I was about to say, I'm sure we would all agree, but I think that is potentially a stretch in this debate and in this chamber. But I would hope that we would all agree that consumers should be able to buy products online without worrying about their safety, and that product standards shouldn't be bypassed or compromised on any platform, digital or otherwise. However, research from the Office of Product Safety and Standards found that 1810 of products on online marketplaces between 2021 and 2022 failed to meet safety standards. These are products that were on sale to the public. 81% failed to meet product safety standards. This is completely unacceptable, and it underlines the real need for this bill. We cannot allow companies to circumvent essential safety standards, presenting a public health risk just because they sell their products online. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not just about safety. Critically important though that is, it is also about ensuring fairness. Yes. We simply cannot continue with a product safety regime that enables online marketplaces to undercut bricks and mortar retailers, or that allows rogue traders to outcompete responsible retailers with unsafe, low-quality products. That would be unfair on consumers. It is unfair on consumers as things stand. It would be unfair on reputable manufacturers, and also on the small high street businesses that must compete with these online giants. With online sales already making up over a quarter of total retail sales in 2023, we must level that playing field now, providing our high streets with a long overdue boost to their competitiveness. I will.
He's making a very fair point about product regulation, but isn't the issue he's highlighting here one of not of product regulation itself, because he's already saying that these products don't meet the safety standards there. This is actually about enforcement. So the product regulation standards, no issue with that. No issue with legislating for that. They're already in existence. In fact, we know they're in existence because he can tell us that they don't meet them. So isn't the actual issue he's highlighting actually purely around enforcement, which this bill does absolutely nothing to address?
So I disagree that it is purely around enforcement. Obviously, there are elements of enforcement, but separating out one part of a package, a regulatory framework that will future-proof us from other parts, is not a coherent argument. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is vital that we create a product safety, regulatory and metrology framework that protects consumers, encourages fair competition and meets the changing picture internationally. This bill delivers that framework, and I look forward to supporting it further in this House.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to declare my interest as having 40 years in the toy industry and in another life having been the chair and the president of the British Toy and Hobby Association. Wonderful job. Second best job. Best job is being the first ever Liberal Democrat MP for Wokingham.
And the last.
I doubt that very much. Doubt it very, very much. Nearly a decade since the Brexit referendum, this House is still grappling with what it means to be outside of the European Union. Because away from the big headlines about trade deals and newly erected borders, the technical nitty-gritty of product safety and metrology is ever more important now that we must decide what we want our policies to be in this area. Our original framework, derived from EU law, must now keep up with fast-evolving technologies and consumer behaviours. Technological changes in the 21st century may have created new opportunities, but they have also left us exposed to new risks, such as AI, battery hazards, and e-bike fires. Our online marketplaces and the complex digital commerce that facilitates it have reduced barriers to SMEs to share their products across the UK and the world. But it is in many ways still a wild west of the internet that leaves small businesses and consumers exposed. This is why there are aspects of this bill that Liberal Democrats welcome. We fully understand and support the need to update the regulatory framework for the UK marketplace to give businesses and consumers confidence in their product. We welcome in principle the powers in the bill to put new responsibilities on online marketplaces throughout the supply chain. We also support enhanced consumer protection for products which pose a safety risk. Madam Deputy Speaker, the product regulations falling within the scope of this bill will have an impact on our country's trade policy. And when it comes to trade, Liberal Democrats are clear. We believe that the government must pull the most powerful and most readily available lever at its disposal to kickstart economic growth by urgently launching negotiations for a new UK-EU customs union. It would create jobs, boost our public finances and reverse much of the damage inflicted upon our economy by the previous Conservative government's terrible trade deal with Europe. So I want to take this opportunity to urge the government to move in that direction and to commit that as part of these trade negotiations they will use the provisions within the bill to facilitate a new customs union which can have such a transformable effect on our economy. Yep.
I'm really grateful to him for engaging with the issues about product safety and consumer protection in the bill. He's making a serious speech in relation to that. Could I just say to him, first of all, on the point of the customs union, which was skillfully woven in, of course that would preclude us from reaching any arrangement with the United States or with India or with the Gulf or with other countries. And I think, for my money, if you wish to be part of something without a say in how that would affect your trade policy, I think that would be a very difficult position to take. But he was right to say, and I just want to come back to the references made by Conservative MPs who often feel like they're fighting, the old war, the last one. They can't get past it.
First, can I gently suggest to the Secretary of State this was meant to be an intervention? And secondly, we're quite definitely debating the second reading of the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, not a customs union. Perhaps the Secretary of State will conclude his remarks.
I will. I just wanted to say, in relation to the references to the number of references made in this bill to the EU, the point here is that the EU is explicitly referenced simply because UK product regulations are currently derived from a lot of EU regulations. So we have to reference that when looking to the future, and particularly when we recognise some of those European standards. But it's wrong to simply look at those references and try and make that out to be something it's not.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for your intervention, Secretary of State. You are right when you... Sorry. The Secretary of State is right when he talks about us needing to keep up with EU regulations. We definitely need to be doing that. So, despite the potential within this bill, it unfortunately contains very little actual policy to speak to. It relies far too heavily on secondary legislation which limits opportunities for parliamentary scrutiny and provides little clarity as to what the government actually intends to do with the powers it is giving itself. It is hurling us into a hokey-cokey trade policy where at the political whims of ministers we can stick ourselves into aligning with the EU just as easily as we can throw ourselves out of it all over again, if that's what another government decides it wants to do. This will hurt business confidence because the underlying regulations of our country can be easily altered without the appropriate levels of scrutiny from Parliament. Taking a step back from the issue of EU alignment, This is a principle that can apply across any of the areas that this bill seeks to regulate. It is developing opaque mechanisms where the government expects us to trust them to do better. However, those on the government benches must contend with the fact that they will not be there forever. All the potentially positive things that they could do with this legislation could be reversed or made worse by a different government. It is here that I must recognise the excellent work of the Liberal Democrat peers in another place. For example, a Lib Dem Lord introduced an amendment which protected the use of the unique British pint measurement, ensuring that the bill could not prevent or restrict its use for beer, cider or milk in the iconic pint milk bottle. Liberal Democrat peers pressed the government to introduce stronger protection against lithium-ion batteries. A Liberal Democrat peer also ensured that the government included an important amendment that requires the Secretary of State to publish a statement setting out how the government expects to identify and assess product safety risks before legislation is laid. This is to put simply that there is greater scrutiny of regulations that are designed to make products safe. Despite those improvements, the bill is ultimately still a skeleton framework that shifts legislative authority from Parliament to the Executive without the necessary level of scrutiny. Many great ministers agree with me that skeleton bills are the wrong way to deliver legislation. In fact, one of his shadow ministerial roles a mere 2 years ago in 2023 stated that bills are not a model example of how Parliament would like to see legislation brought forward, and that we would be minimising the use of delegated powers where possible. Now, I agree with that then Shadow Minister. In fact, he's now sitting next to the Secretary of State. And that is who's bringing forward the bill today. I'm sorry he doesn't agree with himself anymore. I also note the government's assurances given to my Liberal Democrat colleagues in the other place that a process for editing statutory instruments will be brought forward. We will be pushing for details on that pre-legislative consultation as it progresses through the Commons. Any government will say it is acting in our best interests. But all of the things that this bill could do, such as enhancing consumer safety, reducing trade barriers and building an economy fit for the future, could be undone at the stroke of a pen. That is a pen that Parliament should hold, not ministers.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank you. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. The use of hazardous chemical flame retardants in domestic furniture has been criticised by the Association of Master Upholsterers and Soft Furnishers and in a 2019 Environmental Audit Committee report because these chemicals have been shown to cause more toxic smoke, increase the production of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, and increase the prevalence of health conditions, including developmental disorders, breathing difficulties and reproductive disorders. So as this bill would provide the government more powers to act on this issue, does my honourable friend agree with me that the Minister should outline what actions the government plans to take to address the dangers associated with CFR use?
I thank the honourable lady for my honourable friend for her question, and I do very much agree with that, and I hope that the right honourable gentleman will address her question if they heard it. The bill gives the possibility of new powers, and this would be a good place in which it will start. The Minister in the other place stated that this government is not looking to reduce consumer protections. However, what measures in this bill make sure that parliamentary scrutiny cannot be bypassed to weaken protections? The skeletal nature of the bill also makes clear what is missing. The very heart of our changing economy is nowhere to be seen. Online marketplaces are rapidly expanding in numbers. Can I just carry on a bit? Thanks. Online marketplaces are rapidly expanding in numbers and popularity, contending with high streets across the nation. But there is unfortunately not a level playing field for these two competitors to battle it out for the cash of consumers. That is what the bill should be addressing, because our high streets and our small businesses must contend with regulations that online marketplaces are not equally liable for. This is not a level playing field. For example, unsafe products are flooding online marketplaces. A study from which revealed that 90% of toys purchased from Amazon, eBay, AliExpress and Temu were illegal due to posing choking and strangulation hazards. Another study from the British Toy and Hobby Association found that 85% of toys from online marketplaces were unsafe, with 8% also illegal due to missing warnings. Do we want this situation to continue?
Will you give way on that point?
I will give way.
And I note the language which the member has made, that many of these toys were illegal. In other words, the law was there already. So this bill is not necessary to deal with children choking on toys or all of the other things he's outlined. The law's already there. The question is, do we actually implement the law?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I think that the law needs to be tightened up here. We do need to be taking more, definitely a lot more interest in the product that online companies are selling, which is unsafe. So, yeah, sorry. Do we want this situation to continue? Do we want to allow toys sold by some faceless online operation through an online market to our precious children to be unsafe? I'm sure the answer is no. But this bill, as it is written, currently fails to address this. It is not just limited to toys, it expands to heaters, phone chargers and batteries. The government have signalled an ambition to bring online marketplace liability in line with more traditional models of retail. But an ambition can be easily reversed by a different government without parliamentary oversight and without it being explicitly put onto the bill. Consumers and the high street are not receiving the guarantees that they deserve. It is a serious issue for children and personal safety, and therefore we need explicit guarantees of minimum duties for online marketplaces on the face of this bill. Therefore, I will be grateful for the Minister's view as to whether a duty to notify consumers who have been sold unsafe or illegal products will be levied on online marketplaces, whether this potential duty will enhance consumers' rights to seek a refund of the purchase price, and whether a requirement to verify the identity and activities of their sellers will also be established. If it is a yes to any of those questions, then the Minister should do the right thing and amend the bill so that those guarantees are enshrined in primary legislation. I could go on. The bill requires a tighter definition of an online marketplace to ensure that there are no loopholes for platforms to avoid appropriate regulations. This is especially the case for platforms that do not exist solely as an online marketplace like TikTok Shop and Facebook Marketplace. Finally, the bill does not make explicit reference to e-bikes, e-scooters or lithium-ion batteries safety, despite one being of the explicit aims of the bill. E-bike and e-scooter battery fires pose a uniquely high risk to consumers, with the London Fire Brigade estimating that they attend a fire incident with one of these devices once every 2 days. There needs to be stronger regulations against them. Can the Minister explain as to why they are not including this on the face of the bill? Thank you.
Kirsteen Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents could have been forgiven for thinking the clock had turned back. So I am going to focus my remarks on the issues that they've wanted me to raise, and they're not whimsical in the slightest. Their concerns rest on safety issues, and I do concur with my right honourable friend's remarks that whilst this is a small bill, it is a very important bill. Indeed, it is one that is of great interest to my constituents, in particular those in Turficking Community Council in my constituency of Bathgate and Linlithgow, who asked me to come and speak in this debate today. They are backing Electrical Safety First campaign, and they highlighted to me their concerns about the dangers of e-scooters and e-bike fires caused by lithium-ion batteries in everyday products. The lithium-ion battery safety campaign is calling for stronger measures like improved enforcement efforts, particularly online, as well as disposal guidance to be given at the point of sale and measures to ensure safer charging. And I hope ministers here today will give strong consideration to these matters in due course. Lithium-ion batteries are integral to many modern devices that we all have in our homes today, from e-scooters to laptops. However, widespread use has exposed some significant safety concerns. And a lot of that is down to the lack of oversight. We've heard about batteries linked to numerous fire incidents posing serious risk of injury or worse. Thermal runaway is a dangerous phenomenon where the battery cells overheat and catch fire, releasing toxic gases and often causing extensive damage. By their very nature, e-scooters are often left in town centres or walkways, or in communal areas, in flats, or in hallways in the home. And they often put other members of the public at risk should thermal runaway occur. And as we've heard, in London, these e-bike and e-scooter fires occur as often as once every 2 days. And worse still, I am aware of domestic incidents in my constituency where, sadly including one family, who lost their home and all their belongings due to an e-scooter fire. The bill introduces some welcome steps to address these risks, creating the landscape to address the dangers associated with these products that are so widely used. The mandates on safety standards for the storage, use and disposal of lithium-ion batteries will help mitigate the dangers associated with thermal runaway. And I do welcome the bill's new powers to monitor compliance and enforce regulations effectively. It is absolutely critical that only safe and reliable products reach the market and reach our homes. Such measures are essential to prevent incidents and protect people from serious harm, such as that which affected my constituents. There is much in this bill which has been long awaited at a local level, and I'm glad that the Government is responding to these concerns in a timely and stringent manner. The danger posed by poorly maintained or safely stored lithium-ion batteries is too great to be ignored. Yes, sir.
To the Honourable Lady giving way. Is it her understanding there are insufficient regulations on lithium-ion batteries as they stand? Because there's British standard, there are environmental, there are disposal regulations. There's a whole swathe of regulations affecting lithium-ion batteries, and if they fail to be enforced, that is not a matter that needs to give carte blanche to ministers to decide on a whim what products in this area or any other should be available for sale in the UK without any recourse to Parliament.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution. I don't think we want to rerun the Brexit arguments, and I think largely so far that's what this debate has been about. Clearly this has been brought forward because there are gaps that have left consumers exposed to great harms, and these are the issues that this bill is seeking to address. Now, the prominence of online marketplaces is an established trend in our society, and we all know from the pandemic how essential and sometimes non-essential online purchases can be to our daily lives. And they've become commonplace, and the trend's only set to continue. By the end of the decade, online purchases will be worth £156 billion. Nevertheless, many products are poorly regulated, faulty, and too often they're dangerous. Whether it's a cheaply renovated student flat kitted out with carbon monoxide alarms that don't work, or the faulty chainsaw attachments used by a neighbour, or a faulty e-scooter sitting in a back garden, these faulty products have come as the pace of change online has been poorly matched by regulations. We're in a situation now where regulations in the online world don't match the protections in the real world. And quite simply, if a product is too dangerous or fails standards of those that are sold in shops, then it should not be freely available in online marketplaces. As a society, our increasing reliance and use of the digital world needs to be protected if we are not to see the lack of online protections have yet more devastating real-life impacts. I'm just about to conclude, thank you. This bill is a welcome step to alter the regulatory landscape. More importantly, it will attempt to ensure basic product safety and better oversight on products such as lithium batteries on our streets. The bill can reduce the risks associated with thermal runaway and protect our communities from potential harm. As online marketplaces continue to expand, it's essential to extend these regulations to the digital realm, responding to the evolving challenges of modern technology and safeguard public safety.
Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak with deep concerns about this Orwellian bill for what it does not explicitly say, and for the ambiguity regarding EU dynamic realignment. Also, for the Henry VIII powers this bill gives to ministers, which has serious consequences to businesses, consumers, and our ability to trade, but does so with little detail on how they intend to use such powers. Let me first turn to the matter of regulatory alignment. I spent much time, Madam Deputy Speaker, you may recall, taking the EU retained law bill through as a whip. And I believe passionately in this piece of legislation, which was vital to take back control, parliamentary sovereignty, and freeing businesses to compete by shedding unnecessary EU regulations, directives, and red tape. So I will say plainly, this bill will lead to regulatory alignment with the EU through the back door. I invite the Minister to confirm from the dispatch box that this bill and the powers it gives ministers will not be used for dynamic alignment with EU regulations by this government. I doubt any such categoric reassurance is likely to be forthcoming, but I await with bated breath and hopeful heart that it be so. And, and let me make some progress and then I will. The government has always claimed it wouldn't return us to the single market and the customs union, and many did believe them. And I was always a healthy skeptic, but I'm always willing to be proven wrong. And this bill, is my fear that this bill will lead to backdoor EU regulatory alignment. Whether that is deliberate or unintentional matters not. We had our democratic instructions from the British people, and we must honour them. I now want to talk about competition, and I believe that... let me make some progress and then... Well, I'm now on to competition. Would you like to make a comment on...
This is turning into a debate in itself. It's very clear... One moment, Miss Morrison. It's very clear that the member doesn't want to take an intervention right now, Mr. Snell, but maybe in the future.
I now want to talk about competition, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I believe I will give way on the point of competition.
Persistence sometimes pays off, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would genuinely want to pick up the point that the Honourable Lady is making about competition from point of alignment. So, in the ceramic sector, food contact material regulations, as set by the European Union, are integral to allow exports of the products that we create and make. They are a product regulation for safety. She seems to be suggesting that any regulatory alignment is a bad thing. Is that the message that I should take back from her party to the thousands of job workers in Stoke-on-Trent about alignment for the purposes of exports?
Thank you. With export regulations, one can apply any kind of regulations they want to maximize our market advantage from leaving the EU. So we could apply the statutory framework for Japan for any country that we wanted to make sure that we could export our products. And the point of leaving the EU was so that we could remain globally competitive. And we could choose to adopt any regulatory framework we wanted to if that market provided us with the ability to export our products and to support our businesses and to help grow our economy. And I'd be supportive of that. But nothing in that is mentioned in the bill whatsoever. If we mention Japanese realignment with market values so we could export things to Japan or to other markets, I'd be interested in looking at this bill holistically, but not once is any other country or any other grouping of trade mentioned except the EU, which gives me pause and makes me wonder, is this a backdoor realignment to EU regulatory frameworks? And is it trying to do so without the scrutiny of Parliament at the same time? I will give way.
I mean, would you also accept that this bill is not necessary to promote exports? If a company is going to export to Japan or Timbuktu and there are regulations which exist in those countries, if they want to sell their products to it, they'll have to align with those anyway, and doesn't need a government bill, or far worse, a government minister to have the power without coming here to make the regulations.
Completely with what the honourable gentleman has said, and I will leave it there because it is an excellent point. And it is about free trade and about expanding our global reach by making money, by growing our economy and allowing everyone to benefit from a tax base that grows because our businesses can export freely. I'm very supportive of that. And if this bill in any way addressed those concerns or those issues, I would be happy to support this. But this bill is vague. In a moment, this bill is vague, does not give us the insight that we need in terms of what kind of alignment we are talking about. And because of its vagueness, it gives a challenge that the other place mentions over and over again. Many of the ministers have said this. In this House, we must ensure that we provide a similar rigor to the challenges this piece of legislation carries. And it may look on the outside to be quite harmless, but that has consequences and delivering profound change underneath the surface. And I'm afraid that our parliamentary ability to scrutinize these regulatory changes is under threat with this piece of legislation. And in the other place, the noble Lord Sandhurst described this as a Henry VIII bill par excellence. Those are the words we would do well to heed. So I say, the government, where is the policy framework on which ministers will decide to use these powers? There is not one. On the issue of parliamentary sovereignty or on the issue of ministers who will decide to use these powers? I will give up.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and as a fellow member of the Procedure Committee, I do enjoy a good procedural debate. But I do wonder if she will be getting to the meat of the bill at any point, or will we be talking about Brexit bogeymen or around consumer safety and actually representing the people we are here to represent, looking after their interests and making them safer?
My friend, for that point, because this bill is an actual legislative blank sheet of paper for ministers to fill with whatever they want, whatever legislation that they feel like filling. The Lords Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee stated that this bill signifies an exceptional shift in power from Parliament to the executive and entails the government, in effect, asking Parliament to pass primary legislation which is so insubstantial that it leaves the real operation of the legislation to be decided by ministers.
Quite right.
I say to the members right across this House, heed those words. If we do not stay alert to legislation that looks so harmless and yet confers such powers to ministers, then we are failing in our role as legislators. Madam Deputy Speaker.
Yes.
is my honourable friend aware of any other piece of legislation which the DPRRC in the House of Peers has reported on 3 times with exactly the same conclusions?
I am not aware of any, that my friend makes an excellent point, and I am not aware of any other piece of legislation that has conferred the same recommendation 3 times. Yeah. And it does give a warning, a substantial warning. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill, either deliberately or unintentionally, will lead to realignment with the EU and once again leave our country beholden to the decisions of others on what regulatory standards we want. This bill will hamper our businesses in the fast-changing world, making them less agile, less competitive, and us poorer as a nation. This bill gives ministers too much power, a fact which in this House should always be pause for thought, no matter who governs. I urge the government to think again.
Creasy. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I hope to offer perhaps a course corrective to the attempts to fight many things that the opposition have been doing today, not least of all the concept of geography, and in terms of British businesses and what is in their interest. Because what we are watching unfold here are the last gasps of the Brexit delusions that have fallen on hard contact with the paperwork reality. And that's what this piece of legislation is about, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's about making it easier for British businesses who have been harmed by the approach of the previous government to their basic needs. Because this is not about free trade. It's not free trade that's come out as a result of Brexit. There's just mountains and mountains of paperwork. And I want to focus on that in my speech, but I cannot let go that the previous member's speech, she was, as she says, a whip on the retained EU law. My goodness me, I welcome a sinner repenteth. Because that was over 4,000 pieces of legislation that the government was going to rip up overnight without any parliamentary scrutiny, simply because they had the word Europe in them, including things like airline regulations, because of course what we needed was our own separate regulations so that a plane mid-air would have to take a different course, because that was the Brexit benefit. And indeed, under her previous government's watch, over 2,000 statutory instruments were laid as a direct result of the retained EU law. Now, I welcome the commitment of the opposition parties to parliamentary scrutiny. I simply offer that some of us who sat on that committee tried to offer some of these debates and arguments to them about the importance of parliamentary involvement in these decisions. They fell on deaf ears. Well, I'm actually going to come to that, and I hope that the members opposite, now they've suddenly discovered that maybe statutory instruments aren't always the best way to look at these issues, can focus on what really matters here. Because British business needs us to do that. British business needs us to clear up the mess created by the previous administration and their approach to Brexit, and that's what this legislation is doing. It's common sense politics. Of course I'll give way if he absolutely can tell me which of those 2,361 statutory instruments he now regrets forcing through this House.
Interesting point. I think the key point, though, is that on that EU law carryover, all of those regulations had already been debated, already gone through Parliament. So all you're doing is replacing like for like, essentially. What you're doing with this legislation is giving huge Henry VIII powers to create brand new legislation, perhaps, for example, around product regulations, but maybe about, who knows, right? Who knows what they're going to impact on, what countries are going to be impacted. That's the difference. We're actually removing parliamentary scrutiny here, rather than just carrying on old EU laws into current UK laws.
I mean, there are so many things to unpack there, not least his recognition that actually perhaps the previous regulations that we had being part of the European Union maybe weren't that bad, that maybe it was actually pretty sensible if you had a rule about, bicycle safety, that something that was safe in the UK, our colleagues in Europe might be looking at and sharing the burden of working out what good regulation would be. That's not actually what happened with the retained EU law bill. That's not actually happened with the divergence, and indeed, it does rather sound like maybe he needs to look at divergence. But thankfully, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've got some statistics for him, and I know he'll be delighted to listen to them. But before we move on, let me just, because the members opposite didn't speak for British business in this debate in their contributions today. I accept the Liberal Democrat spokesman did try, and I recognise his expertise in tournaments. He will recognise that we are talking about thousands of British businesses who are affected by regulations. Basically, what rules do they have to follow to be able to sell in a market that makes their business sustainable? 12% of all businesses in this country will be affected by this legislation, not because there are new rules, but because if we start to diverge from existing regulations, it means they've got to face a choice. Do they continue to follow European legislation so that they can sell into a larger market, or do they try to follow UK legislation and EU legislation, and maybe Japanese legislation as well, and all the paperwork that comes with that? I will give way to my colleague opposite from Beverley, because I can see if I don't, he'll have a heart attack.
I shall survive, but I'm grateful to the honourable lady. But I'm surprised, given she has had time in the House, and that some newer members may have been taken in by the government wording for this. But this gives such blanket powers to ministers. Sure, they can do more of the alignment with EU regulation, which she desires. Equally, another government, another minister, could go absolutely the opposite way, doing all the damage she's talking about, needlessly differing from Europe purely out of ideology. And this House would have no say in it. So surely it's up to colleagues like herself to be more like her honourable friend behind her and share with colleagues the need to restrict the powers of ministers.
Having in vain tried to make exactly those sorts of arguments to the member when he was a minister in the government, telling me that European legislation wasn't good enough for this country, I'll ask him to let me finish my speech and talk about what I think we should be doing, because I want common sense on this legislation, as I think government ministers do. And I just think we need to stand up to those who puff and spout about Europe as though somehow it's a bad thing to make it possible for British businesses to be able to do trade with our nearest neighbours post-Brexit. And for avoidance of doubt, this is not an argument about rejoining the European Union. If I may, I will continue, but I will absolutely take an interview if he wants to. Our colleagues in Northern Ireland know not least the practical consequences of the sorts of divergence, the sorts of obsession with the concept that somehow we've got to always be different and that is somehow sovereignty that happens. They will know what the not for EU labels mean, that impact that it's had on them and their colleagues. That Neil Johnston, the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium, recently told the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee just about this, where you've got a situation where suppliers have to have separate print runs for labelling, that the requirements in shops for posters and edge-of-shelf labelling as well are massively burdensome for small businesses, that what happens is that you end up with a sausage roll that you cannot take across the border between Castlederg and Castlefin, simply because of the way in which the previous government undertook Brexit. I'll happily give way to my colleague. I will, of course, come back if you wish.
When it comes to making speeches in this House, but if she'd read the schedule to the bill, actually food products are not covered by this.
My point is about divergence. I hope he can understand. My point is about what happens when we try to ask businesses to run two different regulatory regimes out of a mistaken ideology that somehow we can't find a way forward. And that's what this piece of legislation is going to do. The member who spoke previously wants to tell us that British businesses were better off as a result of the Brexit freedoms. Well, the numbers and statistics tell us the exact opposite, not just about the fall in GDP or indeed the falls in trade that are predicted. It is in the thousands of businesses, the 16,400 of them, who've given up exporting to the European Union because of the additional paperwork that is created and the additional regulatory regime. I'll happily give way.
Which I got through, and I'm grateful to the honourable member for Walthamstow. She heard the minister at the dispatch box say this wasn't about dynamic realignment. But am I right in understanding her view of this legislation is it's 100% about EU dynamic realignment?
Completely wrong, and I hope he'll give me a chance to make my speech before getting very excited about the sheer word Europe, but to try and understand what we're actually talking about here, which is British businesses and what they need from their governments, which is regulatory certainty. Because, my goodness, if we think that what happened as a result of the Tory hard Brexit has hit British businesses, hit British small businesses who simply could not afford to comply with multiple regulatory regimes, we do know we are in a very uncertain time. We do know the threat of tariffs is going to kill what little business they might have left. As the OBR pointed out to us last week, if global trade disputes escalate to include 20% point rises in tariffs between the USA and the rest of the world, it would reduce GDP by a peak of 1% and reduce the current surplus that we have. So in that environment, we owe it to British business to talk common sense and to talk about what they actually want, which is a reduction in the Brexit red tape that they have to deal with. Because we've been here before on the practical insanity that Brexit generates, the obsession with blue passports at the expense of being able to trade and keep your business going. And we've been here before with the previous government, which is why all of those members opposite who were here before 2024 need to look and hang their heads in shame with some of the arguments that they're making about this. The previous government wanted us to have our own UK charter mark, wanted British businesses to run 2 separate charter mark arrangements. Now, undertaking testing requirements for both the UKCA and the CE, the European one, in order to allow a business to be able to sell in both markets, was costing businesses hundreds of thousands of pounds. The costs assessed raised up to £200,000 per product range. I'm actually quoting from the previous government's own impact assessment of the legislation, and I'm happy to send my colleague who's chuntering on the opposite benches that document to read. UK conformity assessment marking covered goods worth £109 billion. Little wonder, after 4 years, and I believe the member opposite might even have been on that very committee when it happened, those obsessed with the Brexit freedoms, hit with cold hard reality, had to climb down and had to say that British companies that had met European standards had also met the British charter mark. They had to roll over the charter mark because if they had not, their own impact assessment showed it would have cost British businesses up to £1.6 billion in the decade. That is the Brexit bonus of which the members opposite are so proud. Billions of extra costs to British business because they're trying to fill in 2 forms at once to sell the same item to different sets of consumers. This legislation is not just about kite marking, it's about so much more. And we need to be clear that this does not mean that we have automatic access to the EU market, but what it does mean is that British business can look and see what the regulatory landscape might look like ahead of them, which is very important in these uncertain times. It also prevents the UK from becoming a dumping ground for goods that are no longer considered safe in the European Union. And I certainly believe that my constituents need to be confident that we're not going to be flooded with cheap goods that are going to bag them. It also doesn't mean that we have to align automatically, and I hope that answers my colleague opposite's question. I'm not here arguing for automatic alignment. After all, there are examples of where we've taken a different approach. The vaping legislation, something again the members opposite opposed, but actually that put us ahead of European product legislation. The bill, as we've already said, has protections for the British pinting. The Lords wrote those in. But it's also clear that choosing not to participate doesn't mean that UK consumers aren't affected. We saw that with mobile phone charging cables. Even though we are too small a market to influence Apple, the European Union, acting together, made Apple stop telling us multiple cables. And I, for one, as somebody who's carrying around multiple pieces of equipment, I'm very grateful for that. But there are also examples where we might want to ask why we wouldn't learn from our colleagues. Right now, the European Union has been taking the lead on carcinogenic, polycyclic, aromatic hydrocarbons. Basically, what's in a synthetic football pitch? So our kids right now in the United Kingdom are playing on pitches that have dangerous chemicals in them that our European colleagues' kids are not playing on. When we're talking about alignment, sometimes we're talking about sharing good practice about how to make our kids safer, the consumer regulations, product safety that we were talking about. And I suspect that's why the previous government, in the end, with all its obsession with Brexit freedoms, with all the powers that it had, didn't actually diverge very much. Indeed, under their watch, there were only 5 cases of active divergence, 15 of passive divergence, where basically they didn't update regulations. So for all the huffing and puffing, actually when faced with the cold hard reality of whether having different regulatory regimes for goods in this country as opposed to our next door neighbours where we might also want to sell, well, the previous government took the better approach. It didn't actually look to make British businesses try to double up on its paperwork. Indeed, where we have diverged, there are clearly problems that are being stored up, and anybody who's watching the court case about sand eels knows that's coming down the line. This government is not going to mess British business around in the way that the previous government did, with its huffing and puffing about whether previous governments in other countries were friend or foe. We need to make trade work. That means British businesses need less paperwork, and that means being clear about where we will diverge and where we will align and why that makes a difference, what that means for product standards, because I think actually across the House we agree we want high standards. That isn't That isn't delivered by being not European or pro-European. It is delivered by looking at what the regulatory regimes are. That's why it matters that we've actually paused some of the current proposals of divergence about a new recycling label regime, about the not for EU labelling, about the new checks on agri-food imports, where we're looking at actually what works for British businesses so that we make it easier for them to be able to trade. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is why I wanted to speak in this debate, because I think actually what we need to do in this legislation, and I hope Minister will be open to this, is to be clear about the direction of travel and the absolute proper right way as to when Parliament is part of that process. So if we are going to diverge, why that would be in the British interest and how we, as this Parliament, have that conversation, the information that we have, so that we can update our constituents. Constituents who might have businesses with products that take 18 to 36 months to develop. They need to know the regulatory regime, the toys that they might want to make, and which markets they can sell into. That's why it matters that we have parliamentary scrutiny. And I welcome sinners who are repentant about the value of that. But I do not want to see British business faced with the idea that we would have to consult on absolutely everything, because I do not have an erratic fear of the idea that the Europeans somehow will be holding us back if they help us make sure that our kids aren't playing football on pitches that have carcinogenic chemicals on them. That is common sense British politics. That is what this bill needs to deliver. Regulatory uncertainty undermines economic growth. If economic growth is our primary decision in this country, is our primary ambition, then we need to reduce the amount of times we ask British business to be part of consultation, because they need to have confidence about where regulation is going. That's why it matters that we say absolutely we're not going to start diverging for the sake of it, but only because we can see there is a national interest in it. And it matters to so many of our growth ambitions as well, and I'll finish on this point, that construction materials are also covered under the bill. So are construction costs due to rise much further here than they are in the European Union. Many of us who want our hospitals rebuilt, who want to see house building happen, know that if we spend our time giving uncertainty to British businesses about which way those regulations will go, we will not get the investment that we want. That the cold, hard reality of the decisions that many businesses are making means that actually what they don't want is to invest on a risk. So my question to the Minister is, how can we give British business certainty about their direction of travel and make sure that we have absolutely the right consultation process and engagement process for Parliament, so that where there are points where we would diverge, like we did on vaping, we can do that too. It's not an either-or, but frankly we have to get over the idea that somehow if something is European it's taking us back, because 9 years after we left the European Union, 6 years after the legislation to do it, what they are doing still affects our British businesses. And we have a choice in this House. We continue to peddle fantasies, and I'm sorry that the shadow member isn't in his place anymore, when he seemed not even know the capitulation that his previous government must have made in his eye over the charter mark. But we absolutely owe it to British businesses who are being hammered by Tory Brexit, who are facing economic uncertainty, to not add the pile of paperwork in their in tray in the way in which the opposition is doing. And I hope that the Minister, when he sets out that direction of travel, will be open to ideas about how we can secure that. Because British business may have stopped listening to the benches opposite, but they will listen to us if we get this right.
So John Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There are three fundamental points to be made about the bill before us, and I will do so more briefly than the previous speaker, although I'm delighted to follow her. The first is there is a constitutional issue at the heart of this legislation, and it is this. It is about the power of this House, of this Parliament, and the power of the executive. This bill creates a permissive power for the executive to introduce, by regulation, through statutory instrument, all kinds of measures. Now, those who have been in this House for a long time, and those of us who have been in the House for a rather shorter time perhaps too, will know what that means in practice. It means a brief debate in a room upstairs, which will take minutes, perhaps a few minutes, perhaps a little longer. It will be thinly populated, and the measure will be given scant scrutiny. What should happen is the executive should be held to account on the floor of this House or by a committee designed for the purpose, which brings me to my second point about this bill. We once had a European Scrutiny Committee. The task of that committee was to look closely at all kinds of things which emanated from the European Union. And the Honourable Lady who spoke immediately before me described those of us in this House who are sceptical about the European Union as not being rational. She said these were irrational fears about the European Union. Were that to be true, she would probably have a point. But actually our fears are entirely rational ones, because we know what emanated from the European Union during our membership, and it was endless bureaucracy, often gold-plated here, I acknowledge, but nonetheless every kind of rule and regulation, some of which were entirely superfluous to our needs because they were introduced on a pan-European basis. I learned long ago that power is best exercised when it's exercised closest to its effect. When decisions are made, they need to be sensitive to the difference they make to those affected by them. And one of the reasons that I was a passionate supporter of Brexit is because I want power to return to its effect, to the place where it has its effect. And I fear, therefore, entirely rationally, that if the default position as a result of this bill is that we end up with European regulation, it won't be sensitive to its effect. It'll be decided upon far from where the businesses that it affects are located. So the second issue here is about how this measure is scrutinised. And I invite the government to perhaps reinvent some kind of European Scrutiny Committee or something similar. Perhaps you call it a regulatory scrutiny committee. Perhaps it will be a body that allowed the full consideration of each of the measures that the government introduced under this bill, this umbrella bill, to ensure the House was happy with them, felt they were appropriate, felt they'd been tailored in the right way. Perhaps that might be an amendment that the government accepts during the passage of this legislation, given the Secretary of State said he was open-minded to improve the legislation during its passage. The third problem that this bill has at its heart is the assumption that harmonisation, that's the term that's often used, and one should always be terribly fearful when one hears that word, because it's usually not about creating harmony, but about accepting control from elsewhere, that process will snuff out some of the measures that might more usefully be adopted by government and will impose on businesses and others blunt measures which are insensitive to the particularities that prevail in our country. And I do worry about that. I don't say that it's with intent. It seemed to me the Secretary of State made clear it wasn't his intention that should happen, but I just fear that it will. And the regulatory impact assessment of this bill, we have the explanatory notes already, kind of imply that. They said that they say, and the Secretary of State repeated it in his opening remarks, that there are all kinds of changes happening at a pace that require the attention of government, new rules, new regulations, new restrictions, and that pace is so great that it's hard for the government to keep up. And my fear is, therefore, that they will adopt very broad measures rather than ones which are sufficiently tailored, sufficiently refined to meet domestic needs. So with that constitutional problem of the balance between the executive and parliament, with that lack of scrutiny and oversight, which comes from not having a body which can look at these things on a one-by-one basis, and with that tendency to produce broad-brush measures emanating from the European Union, as implied both on the face of this bill and supporting documents, I have grave doubts about this legislation. It's true that we should regulate where necessary. Of course, that's right. is right in the public interest, we do so. But we must always do so with care, because when that regulation becomes burdensome, when it frustrates innovation, when it tempers the ability to produce goods which meet popular demand, rather than becoming helpful to either customers or those that supply them, it inhibits the very things which support those businesses and aid those customers. And I simply invite the Minister, when he sums up, to re-emphasise that the government believes, as I do, in light-touch regulation, in regulation which only applies when there's been appropriate discussion with those affected by it, that there will be a proper dialogue between business and business representatives before new measures are introduced, and that all that's introduced will have the character that I set out, be tailored and specific, and in the British interest. For our role in this place, if it is anything, is to defend the national interest. I know there's a kind of heady internationalism which permeates particular parts of this chamber, and I look to my left towards the Liberal Democrats. There they are. But I've always thought it was more important to stand up for the British people, to represent my constituents the best of my ability, to be, as I described earlier, sensitive to the particularities of the locale that I represent and the country which I love. Is that too much to ask of members of this House? So I don't regard my fears about this bill, contrary to the Honourable Lady's assertion, as irrational. I think they're deeply rooted in a rational fear of the worst this bill could bring.
Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Good regulation is basically the immune system of our nation, often actually unseen. When regulation is working well, when regulation is having the desired effect, actually we rarely see it happening, because it is keeping us safe, it is protecting us from those harms that we essentially outsource to government to keep watch for us, and it is taking the necessary steps and measures to make sure that we are safe, the things that we buy are safe, the interactions that we have in our communities are safe, and that our children are safe. That regulation is a protection, essentially. And what I see that this bill does is this bill gives the scope and the agility for the government, any government, to respond quickly and timely to those new and emerging potential threats that regulation is therefore required to have to protect us from. And I do worry when governments of any colour, including some of the comments, unfortunately, from my own party of late, where we seek to suggest that regulation is of itself a bad thing, that regulation is inherently an inhibitor of growth, that regulation is the heavy hand of the state stopping the illustrious bounds of enterprise, because it often isn't. Often it is about that level playing field. It is about creating the circumstances where actually competitors in Stoke-on-Trent have as much opportunity to compete with their competitors around the country or around the world in a way that we understand to be fair and balanced and proportionate. And this bill, to me, sets us on a course where we're able to do that. And there are some areas where product regulation and the safety that comes with that are lacking. And I think, if the House will indulge me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to once again talk about ceramics and the ceramic industry, because believe it or not, the product regulatory framework and the protections that exist for both the ceramics in terms of the quality of the goods that are purchased, but also the protection of the level playing field, I think could be hugely benefited by actions that the government could take empowered to them from this bill. So currently, as we've discussed from many speakers in this House, there are online drop shipping platforms, these websites that bulk buy things, sell them into the UK, often at a fraction of the price that you could buy them from in the country, often actually faking and forging the identities and brands of British companies, but without any consideration for what you're actually buying. And so there is a great example that I was shown by a company in Staffordshire, Danoon Ceramics. They make a very particular style of ceramic mug. Cost them about £28 to make and about £35 to retail, sometimes up to 50. An online dropshipping website was selling a faked version with the same artwork, with the same made in UK sticker, with the same made in the United Kingdom backstamp on the base of the cup into the UK for about £10. We have no idea whether that product was meeting the materials and articles for food contact regulation that it is required in this country to meet in order to be considered safe. We have no idea what the levels of lead was in the paint, what the levels of cadmium were in the paint. We have no idea what the glaze was made of. We had no idea where the clay had come from. We had no idea what the conditions under which that was made. But that was sold into the UK, thousands at a time, undercutting the British company, but also potentially, for clarity, 1 second. I have no idea, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the product itself was defective, but potentially, because we didn't know, that was a deficient product that could have been putting people at risk, and I'll happily give way.
I collect ceramics, by the way. I'm extremely interested in ceramics, and he's right that the British ceramic industry is something we should support, indeed revere. But there are many laws in existence to prevent the kind of counterfeiting which he's described already. And there are other laws to prevent illegal substances being used and sold in the manufacture of any goods. So there is a lot of existing statute which protects consumers from the kind of practices he described.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comment, and he is right. There are existing protections for some of the things I've mentioned that, if enforced properly, could potentially take those products off the market. But the issue is that enforcement in this country of many of our regulatory frameworks is quite weak. Funding for enforcement, funding for our enforcement agencies across the country have actually been, and I would not to make a party political point, but over the last government there was reductions in funding for most of our enforcement regime. That's something that I hope this government will reconsider, because actually a regulation is only ever as good as the enforcement regime that is sat behind it. Yes, I'll give way.
Member for giving way. And would you accept then that if ministers got up at 9 o'clock in the morning and worked at 9 o'clock at night and introduced regulations on the basis of this bill every day, but there was no enforcement, or the enforcement was as weak as what he is saying in the case of the pottery he's explaining, would be no better off?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody would disagree with the honourable gentleman's assessment that if there is no enforcement of regulation, there is no benefit. But I don't think what we're saying in this bill is there should be less enforcement. What this bill, I think, produces is a framework in which the government can take action to respond to create the good regulation that is necessary. Now, I'll freely admit that what does have to come with that then is what is the enforcement arrangements that are put in place to make sure that those new regulations are enforced properly, that there is a penalty that is considered to be a deterrent for those people that seek to try and circumvent those new product regulations and those safety regulations, and that the enforcement agencies are properly resourced and equipped to take the action against those people and those companies that seek to circumvent the rules. Because without that, then actually, yes, I would fully accept regulation for the sake of regulation is no good, any more than regulation being cut or diverged for the sake of divergence and reduction is any good. It does have to come down to the enforcement. But where, if I can, Madam Deputy Speaker, go back to the comments of the right honourable gentleman from South Holland on the Deepings, there is one area in this bill in particular where government action could actually bring in new product protection regulation that would have a huge impact on the ceramic industry that doesn't currently exist, and that is actually around the backstamp that you have on the bottom of a piece of ceramic or pottery. And as an avid collector, he will be aware of the importance of those backstamps. So we have currently in this country, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you turn over any plate, any cup, anything that is made from good quality British ceramics, you will normally find the words made in England and the pottery name underneath it. And consumers then will know that they are buying a premium piece of British manufactured ceramics that has been made to a suitable product standard that we accept in Stoke-on-Trent is one of the best in the world. It is perfectly plausible, as has been done with some of the fakery, to replicate that phrase when it's not true. The other challenge we have is where organisations and some companies who import things into the United Kingdom will then augment the wording of that particular backstamp in a way to try and suggest that it has been made in the UK, when in fact it hasn't. It may have been bisque fired overseas and imported, it may have been decorated and glazed in the UK, but it will have a company name, normally the word England, and normally the date upon which that historic brand was established. It gives consumers the idea that they are buying a piece of British-made ceramics that would therefore be protected by the normal product regulation, when in fact it isn't. So there is a potential for the Minister to use the new powers under the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, Act, when it becomes enforced, to say to this particular industry to produce new regulation that says anything that is produced in the UK that is considered to be ceramic has to have a proper mark on the base which demonstrates where it was made, where it has come from, and demonstrate that it is made in the UK. And if you are not making it in the UK, you become prohibited from putting the words England or made in the UK on it. I will give way.
Way a second time, very generous of him. I think we should jointly sponsor a bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. He and I, not you and I. He and I, not you and I, although, Madam Deputy, we'd love you to be involved. The Honourable Gentleman and I could jointly sponsor a bill, and it could be called the Made in Britain Bill, and we could do exactly what he described. But I'm not sure this piece of legislation is necessary to do that. We have that power in this House as it stands. So let's get little crowns printed again on eggs, let's get Made in Britain printed on everything, and let's get what was formerly widely used, foreign made. And I'd love to see foreign made stamped on imported goods, then people wouldn't buy them, would they?
I'm very sorry to disappoint the Honourable Gentleman, but the Ceramics Country of Origin Bill is already presented to this House by me and a number of my colleagues, which he would be more than happy to support should it ever get a second reading in this place. But because of the nature of this place, because of the nature of the way that those bills work, I'm realistic in the fact that if we're going to see that protection and that regulatory protection for British ceramics, then it's going to have to come through another mechanism. And this mechanism that's in this bill that allows the government through secondary legislation to make those protective arrangements does exist in this bill, and we could therefore see an increase in the protection of British ceramics as a result of that. The final point I'd like to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that if we are going to have a level playing field for the export, and I take the point that the Honourable Gentleman, when I intervened on his neighbour earlier, made around the regulatory regime that we have and where we want to export into, the bulk of the ceramics that are made in my constituency are exported into the EU. We could diverge from the food contact material regulation from the European Union, have a secondary system in this country, but all that does is create, on very small companies with very small margins, a separate set of regulatory regimes that would require them to potentially have to make products over twice. That would be a burden that we simply could not stand. Whilst I understand, and before I get attacked for being one of those horrible invaders, I would urge them to check my voting record during that 17 to 19 Parliament. There are times when sticking with what we know with the European regulations make absolute sense. We should control that, but it makes sense to align ourselves when we should. So in conclusion, Madam Speaker, I support the bill. I hope the Minister will consider my points around ceramic and be one of the first things he does with his new powers. And if he doesn't, perhaps he'd like to support my Ceramics Country of Origin bill.
If colleagues speak for too long, other colleagues will be disappointed. So unofficially, let's try and keep our speeches to below 10 minutes. Sammy Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Anyone listening to this debate today would think that it's all about saving children from being choked when they have toys, buildings not being burnt down because defective batteries in bicycles, the saving lives, having safe products. We even had reference to the internal market and to safeguarding the Northern Ireland economy. But of course, it's nothing all about that. It's nice to dress it up like that, and I suppose it's helpful to, if you want to try and make it relevant to constituents, to use that kind of language. But that's nothing about. It's nothing about that. As we have seen time and time again, when members have spoken about the kind of issues, whether it's batteries going in fire or toys that are defective or whatever, all of those things can be and have been dealt already in law. Indeed, we have even had members talking about illegal products being sold. So it's not that we need some minister to change the law, it's simply we need someone to ensure that the laws which are in place at present are enforced. And if there are gaps in the law, then since we already have the mechanism to make things illegal, then we just use the same mechanisms as we have been using in the past. So let's not obscure what this debate is all about. This debate is not about the need and the gaps which there are to safeguard people. This is all about an agenda which is contained in this bill to give ministers additional powers. Now, I've got to say to the public outside, when they see a government with already a majority of over 200 that's been able to drive through legislation which has frustrated and angered the population, whether it's taken money off pensioners for winter fuel, whether it's last week driving through legislation to meet the net zero agenda, but which failed to stop and put on the face of a bill the prevention of buying solar products from China, where they were made by slave labour, and we could go through all of the other things which have made people angry. And yet a government with over a 200 majority now wants to take on additional powers to allow a minister to avoid having to come to this House in order to bring issues to the House which ensure product safety. And I have no doubt that the real reason why ministers wish to retain that power is because the government has already set its mind on resetting our relations with Europe. They know it's unpopular with many of their supporters. They don't want to have constant scrutiny of that in this House on a weekly or a monthly basis, coming forward with new regulations which align us with Europe. So far, far better to give ministers the power to go and do that, and to do it quietly, to do it without consultation in this House, to do it without a vote in this House. And indeed, the bill, as already been mentioned by a number of members already, gives the power to do that. And indeed, even some of the government's own supporters in the House of Lords made the point that the potential for dynamic realignment is contained within the bill. The government has been ambiguous about whether or not the powers we use to do that, but I'm fairly sure that that's the main reason for that. And that's one, apart from the fact that I believe that there's little enough opportunity for this House to look at legislation and to challenge legislation. I believe that it's wrong that we should have a bill which allows, under the cover of darkness or under the cover of ministerial power, to take us back into arrangements which we have escaped from. And people have mentioned Northern Ireland, and we know the impact of the EU General Product Safety Regulations already, because they apply in Northern Ireland. And for businesses in the rest of the United Kingdom that want to sell their products in Northern Ireland, they're going to have agents in Northern Ireland. Now, I suspect that one of the reasons, and the EU make these laws to try and tie other countries and other companies to their own regulations. I suspect that one of the reasons why we will find that the government will follow dynamic alignment is because they'll be able to use the excuse, we're doing it for the good of businesses in GB as well as Northern Ireland. Because if we're aligned to EU rules, then we escape some of the restrictions on trade which the EU have imposed. But why did we leave the EU in the first place? And why did many businesses support leaving the EU in the first place? Because, first of all, the EU introduced costly regulations, which in many cases didn't even need to apply to those businesses, because they never traded with the EU. But they still had to introduce the regulations, adjust their products to meet with them, and that imposed costs. And I'll give it.
I'm listening with intent to the honourable gentleman's contribution. And it may be that the government are more innocent, he suggests. It may be there is not this hidden agenda he's described. But in the words of a Northern Irishman, C.S. Lewis, of all the tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for its victims may be the most oppressive. So even if there isn't a hidden agenda, in the end, in the name of the victims, the customers, this will end up as regulatory, bureaucratic and costly.
Well, the potential is there, and the potential has been put in the bill. And I suspect that the reason why Clause 2.7 has been included in the bill is to give that opportunity, if not now, at some future time. And I mean, the other reason why businesses have opposed this implementation of EU regulations, and the other danger of dynamic alignment, of course, is that many of the laws made in Europe and many of the regulations which we may be aligning ourselves with only get there in the first place because some powerful lobby groups lobby the EU Commission, get the regulations imposed. They may well suit one particular industry or even powerful firms within that industry, but they don't necessarily benefit all of business. So to say that, oh, this will give certainty to business, it may give actual additional costs to business. Now, some may think that, well, given what happens in Northern Ireland and the way in which our market with the rest of the UK has been disrupted, surely coming from Northern Ireland, I would welcome this. And I don't welcome it for two reasons. First of all, as I pointed out to the member from Walthamstow, many of the restrictions are around goods which are not even included in this legislation. The schedule excludes them. And secondly, if this problem is solved, we know that because Northern Ireland is subject to the EU single market regulations, 300 areas of law, as a member for North Antrim keeps reminding us on a almost weekly basis, 300 areas of law apply to Northern Ireland. You solve this problem, but it doesn't deal with the issue. The issue is that we have allowed the United Kingdom to be divided by the deal that was done with Europe. Yeah. And I mean, when the government was in power, I warned that this would happen, that Northern Ireland would be the foot in the door. And I believe that this will be used as one of the arguments for this legislation. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we'll be opposing the legislation tonight. We will be opposing it because we believe it's not in the interest of the United Kingdom, and we believe that it doesn't address the problems which are faced in Northern Ireland either. Well done, Sam.
I thought it was remiss that the speech by South Holland and the Deepings member didn't have a literary person in, but he got C.S. Lewis in at the end. Adam Thompson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I believe, as the Secretary of State said earlier, I think the first metrologist elected to this House in history. It gives me great pleasure indeed to rise today. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, I took the liberty of checking Hansard before today, and until the Secretary of State said it earlier, I was the only person in history to use the word metrologist in the House of Commons. So I'm very proud to be here today, and I'm prouder still that the Labour government has brought forward this bill featuring metrology in our first year of a new government. Despite the majority of debate today, Madam Deputy Speaker, has focused on the product regulation side of this bill. Given my background, I'd like to focus on the metrology. Prior to my election to this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was at the University of Nottingham, throughout which I was research active in metrology for advanced manufacturing, beginning with my PhD and continuing through several more years as a research fellow and latterly a senior research fellow. But like most people I have known in my life, when I first began my PhD, I had absolutely no idea what metrology was. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure several colleagues around this room didn't know what it was before today, and I fear still don't. If you'll allow me, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to provide for the record some explanation as to the nature of my science and explain why, contrary to popular assumption, it has absolutely nothing to do with clouds. The international standard, yes, please do forgive the terrible pun there. The international standard, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Vocabulaire International de Metrology, formally defines metrology as the science of measurement and its application, noting that metrology includes all theoretical and practical aspects of measurement, whatever the measurement uncertainty and its field of application. It isn't, Madam Deputy Speaker, the branch of science concerned with the processes and phenomena of the atmosphere, especially as a means of forecasting the weather, which is, of course, meteorology, something I have explained almost every day of my professional career. Metrology broadly encompasses the various fields of research that seek to develop the science and technology of measurement, be that measurement of any of the 7 base quantities from the Système International des Unités, the SI, or any of the units derived from these base quantities. The 7 base quantities are, of course, length, mass, time, electric current, thermodynamic temperature, amount of substance, and luminous intensity. The great physicist, Lord Kelvin, once expressed, to measure is to know, and also if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. These sentiments are rarely more applicable than in the advanced manufacturing industry, where we are interested both in ensuring that a manufactured component meets the dimensional specification laid out by its designer and in constantly improving upon existing products. Metrology is a science that fundamentally underpins all other science. Without tools that allow us to measure, allow us to know, we cannot gain any understanding into the world around us, nor can we improve upon it. In the fundamental scientific pursuit of understanding our universe, we are most often concerned with the first of the SI-based units, the meter. The meter is defined, Madam Deputy Speaker, formally by taking the fixed numerical value of the speed of light in a vacuum C to be 299,792,458 when expressed in the units meters per second, where the second is defined in terms of the cesium frequency. This definition changed, in fact, very recently. It came into force in 2018. But the meter is more simply described by its older definition, and it's simply the distance travelled by light in a vacuum in a time interval in seconds of 1 divided by the speed of light. In my opinion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the meter is one of the most beautiful creations in science, defined by light itself, and a creation which allows us in turn to create everything in our world. At the start of our debate today, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Member for New Forest West asked the House, when did weights and measures become metrology? Well, I'd like to explain now, Madam Deputy Speaker. The answer to that question is several thousand years before the Common Era. Behind every great scientific advancement in history, there has been a metrologist. Behind the pyramids, there were the first standardised unit of measurement, the royal cubit, defined as the length of the pharaoh's forearm, as measured from the tip of his forefinger to the base of his elbow. The cubit was a technology so advanced that it allowed the ancient Egyptians to position the building blocks of the pyramids to an accuracy almost equal to modern methods. And thousands of years later, there remains speculation as to whether they were in fact built by aliens, because of how incredible an achievement that was. They were, of course, not built by aliens, Madam Deputy Speaker. They were built by metrologists.
Will the honourable gentleman give way?
I will gladly give way.
I am grateful at the start of this debate, as a fellow scientist, I wondered what the difference was between mensuration and metrology. Because when I was an undergraduate, we did not use the word metrology. It seems to be a new word. Maybe the honourable member can enlighten the chamber.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, certainly. Not a new word as far as I'm concerned. I believe it was brought into common parlance in the Victorian era. To move on to some more examples, Madam Deputy Speaker, behind the James Webb Space Telescope, something more modern than the pyramids, the James Webb Space Telescope now takes images of our universe more than 13 billion light years away. Images more deep, more brilliant and more beautiful than anything we have ever seen. There is a construction behind this of a 6.5 metre mirror, flat to within just a few tenths of billionths of a metre. from its highest top to its smallest valley. If we were to expand the size of this 6.5 metre mirror to the size of the Earth, the highest mountain to the deepest valley would be on the order of the height of my hip. Behind the discovery of gravitational waves, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are a series of interferometers, kilometres in size, that can detect signals from noise at levels considered unachievable throughout human history until the past 20 years or so, capable of listening to the collision of black holes across space-time. I would gladly give way.
I hesitate to interrupt the honourable gentleman because this is a wonderful contribution to our affairs. It is indicative of the beauty of science, and we hear too little about that. But before he rushes, hurtles, one might say, into the future, could he say a word, too, about the peculiarly British measurements which informed my childhood? Things like pecks, perches, rods, bushels. For each of those, in the way he's described, was rooted in the way that he described.
For his intervention, Madam Deputy Speaker, and happy to explain. I mean, these particular forms of measurement are not in common use anymore, but of course, many members, and right honourable members in the House, will have grown up with these. They are broadly, the ones that are still in use, defined in the modern parlance, but I think it's important to remember that the modern metric system accounts for all of these heritage measurements. The common inch, for example, formerly defined as 25.4 millimetres. The pint. I apologise to members across the House. It's important for me to let you know the pint is formally defined as 568 millilitres.
You have to declare an interest.
These heritage measurements, and indeed the entire imperial system, is now referenced onto the metric system. Defined very simply, the imperial system is the metric system. And there's no reason why we shouldn't use these historical measurements. Where useful, they are perfectly valid. But they are formally defined within reference to the modern metric system. And I'm going to talk about this shortly. Metrology, Madam Deputy Speaker, lies at the heart of everything we know, from telescopes to speed cameras to knee replacements or jet engines. Every single thing made by human hand was designed first, constructed second, and then checked by a metrologist to ensure it met its specifications. If we cannot know it, we cannot improve it. However, ensuring parts meet their specifications is not simple, as each measurement, dimensional or otherwise, has an associated measurement uncertainty. That is a non-negative parameter characterising the dispersion of the quantity values being attributed to the thing being measured, based on the information used. Estimation of measurement uncertainty is a complex procedure. It formed much of my career prior coming to this place, and is usually performed in line with the Guide to the Expression of Uncertainty of Measurement. Uncertainty estimation is generally performed by making measurements that are traceable to the definition of the SI metre when we are concerned with the metre. Again, the Vocabulaire International de Metrology defines traceability as a property of a measurement result whereby the result can be related to a reference through a documented, unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to the overall measurement uncertainty. Traceable measurements allow for the successful estimation of uncertainty and are generally a base requirement for the verification of manufactured goods. Traceability is considered by the international community as the only means by which evidence can be provided towards a given product fulfilling the requirements set out by its designer. To provide an example, let us consider, Madam Deputy Speaker, a length measurement made between, say, two faces of a manufactured part. Let's go for a Rubik's Cube. Imagine I'm holding a Rubik's Cube because I couldn't possibly have brought a prop, Madam Deputy Speaker. The length between two faces could be measured by a caliper. This caliper would be calibrated using a measurement artefact, most commonly a metal cuboid called a gauge block. This gauge block would then in turn be calibrated by a more accurate instrument, which is in itself calibrated using a more accurate gauge block. This more accurate gauge block will then be calibrated in reference to an optical interferometer using a laser source. The laser source is finally calibrated against the iodine stabilised laser that is used to realise the definition of the metre.
Good luck, Hansard.
And so traceability is established, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the shop floor measurement all the way up to the definition of the metre by this unbroken chain of calibrations. And we do this in every... I will gladly give way to my honourable friend.
I felt impelled to intervene because my honourable friend is giving a hugely passionate speech about a subject he clearly knows so much about. And I would ask him, how can he help to inspire the next generation of meteorologists and be as inspired about the topic as he clearly is?
That's very kind. I thank my honourable friend very much for his intervention. Indeed, if he wishes, I've got a 97-slide lecture here that I'd be more than happy to deliver afterwards.
Nobody wishes for the 97 slides. Mr. Thompson.
Don't worry, Madam Deputy Speaker, not one for today. I'm nearly finished. Each stage of the traceability chain has some discernible uncertainty, Madam Deputy Speaker, which generally increases as we move down the chain, as instrument accuracy decreases. Estimation of uncertainty, each link in the chain, is essential. It is impossible to have a traceable measurement without the inclusion of an uncertainty with that measurement. Traceability, when applied in manufacturing, allows us to create anything we can imagine within the confines of our chosen manufacturing process. It is the cornerstone of our modern manufacturing industry. In this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government seeks to update metrology regulations and the means by which those regulations are enforced. We have heard at great length different opinions as to that process, but the Government are today ensuring conformity with the SI system, ensuring uniformity in measurement, sale, monitoring and quantity of goods. They're ensuring further that the Secretary of State and other appropriate bodies have the powers that they require to inspect and enforce that conformity. This bill will ensure that the UK law is updated to recognise new or updated international regulations to keep us at the cutting edge of science and regulation. Members said earlier in the debate how the UK was at the forefront of regulation. I spent many years myself on standards committees working through these things. Every standards committee I ever worked on fed into the British standard, which fed into the European standard and the international standard. These are the frameworks that we are updating today to ensure that we remain at the forefront. This is going to mean cost savings for business, and it will promote regulatory stability. Madam Deputy Speaker, finally, the provisions laid out in this bill continue the work begun by the ancient Egyptians, the work that allowed us to build everything from the Great Pyramids to the phones in our pockets, the paper that we hold in our hands, or indeed the very floor on which we stand today. The work that we are doing today ensures that the bulbs that light this room are of an appropriate brightness, that the air that we breathe and that surrounds us is of an appropriate temperature, and that we can finally get a fairly measured full beverage in the pub of exactly 568 millilitres.
Will the member give way?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I support this bill wholeheartedly.
Follow that, Jerome Mayhew.
Speaker, I don't think I can follow that. I thought that was an absolutely brilliant speech, and I do feel like a party pooper because I'm going to drag the debate back to the product regulation and metrology bill, and I can only apologise. But I was going to assert boldly that I was the only member of this House who sat on the Standards Committee and had drafted European regulations, but I stand corrected, there are now two of us. Looking at this bill, at first glance, it looks tiny. There are just 4 clauses on product regulations and 4 substantive clauses on metrology. But there's a reason why it's so tiny, and it's because it doesn't actually say anything. There's no description of the changes anticipated by this legislation. There's no examples of what needs to be addressed. There's no indication of the direction behind any future decisions. Nothing. During the course of this debate, particularly by members opposite, they've referred to e-bikes and scooters, electrical safety, defective toys, and lithium-ion batteries, just to name a few. Not a single one of those, Madam Deputy Speaker, is on the face of this bill. They could be. This could be a regulation bill trying to fix the problems which have been identified by the members opposite, but it isn't. None of it is there. And worse than that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no explanation as to why there's silence. It simply makes a request of this House, of us as parliamentarians. It's saying, please give me, the Minister, power to change primary legislation by regulations, including, by the way, the power to create new and novel criminal offences. This is the very definition of a skeleton bill. That's where almost all of the substance is left to regulations. And it is in contrary to an established convention in this House and in the other place that the principal aspects of policy should be on the face of a bill and only its detailed implementation left to delegated legislation. That is an established principle of our legislature. So if we wish to depart from that, there needs to be a very good reason. And in exceptional circumstances, there are good reasons. But are there exceptional circumstances here? Because this issue was picked up immediately in what proved to be a hostile reception in the other place at second reading on the 8th of October. And that was followed by a review on the 15th of October last by the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee, which isn't some right-wing conspiracy theory group. This isn't Brexit or die. This is chaired by Labour. It's chaired by Baroness Ramsey. It's cross-party. And she, by the way, in another role, is the senior advisor on standards and ethics to the Labour Party. And yet, her report has been entirely ignored by this government because it was damning in its conclusions. It says, and this is government guidance, that skeleton legislation should only be used in the most exceptional circumstances, and that test was failed by this draft legislation. And as a result of it, that cross-party committee, chaired by Labour, made the recommendation that clauses 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 and 9 should all be removed. Those are the substantive clauses right throughout the bill on both sides. It's a stinging indictment of this category of draft legislation. They were so concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they didn't leave it at that. They took the exceptional step the following day of summoning the Minister and his officials to give oral evidence. Now, that is very rare. It's the first time in 3 years that that has happened. And they were clearly unimpressed with the answers, the attempted explanations they were given, because in a subsequent report on the 28th of October, they reported that the Minister and the official failed to provide a convincing justification. That's a direct quote. Now, as a result of that second damning indictment of the government's approach, there was some movement. There were some removal of some Henry VIII powers, and a duty to consult, in the first instance at least, was added to this bill. But other Henry VIII powers remain, and the duty to consult is only in the first instance, not in secondary attempts. So we then get to a third report from this committee on the bill, which is in the current form that it is before the House today. And they said this, and this is a direct quote: "The delegation to ministers of law-making powers in this bill involves legislative power shifting to an unacceptable extent from the legislature to the executive, and the government has failed to provide a convincing justification for the inclusion of skeleton clauses in this bill." Well, actually, I think the government did understand what it was doing, because within the face of this bill, it gives ministers the power to take politically contentious decisions, the degree to which domestic law on product regulation and indeed on metrology should be aligned with EU laws. And that's the real reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, behind this legislation. The real reason is set out there: the fear of EU alignment by the back door. I will give way.
My experience in this place, and I'm mindful of what he said already, is there are two types of bills to be aware of. The first type is where its provisions are so permissive, so broad, lacking the tailored approach I described earlier, as to allow the law to be applied in a way that's not expected by those who debate the bill as it passes through the House. The second is where a bill makes specific provision for delegated legislation, for subsequent actions by government. And those two types of legislation are legislation to be aware of. And I say that to members from across the House, having seen them introduced by all kinds of governments, those kinds of bills, that become, in the end, bad laws.
I'm grateful for the intervention. I, of course, agree with him. I think this comes to the nub of what I want to raise with honourable and right honourable members. Because, yes, we're party politicians, inevitably. We have the opposition, we have the government, and we have the members on the left-hand side of the opposition. But above that, we're parliamentarians. And some of us are quite new. I may look old, but, and I am, but I was first elected in 2019. There's an awful lot of members in this chamber who may be voting tonight who are even less experienced than me. And it takes a while to begin to understand the difference between the role of the legislature and the role of the executive. And my profound concern is that we are at risk of handing very significant powers from us as legislatures, I will give way.
Just, I thank the honourable member for giving way, but having had these comments several times, I wonder if he would accept that wisdom is not necessarily proportional to the amount of time spent in this chamber.
That. But the conventions of the House and the conventions of the legislature can't just be brushed aside by a comment like that, a flip comment. There are reasons why we have conventions. There is a separation of powers between the executive and the legislature, and the power to create legislation lies with us. And there are grounds, sometimes, that we can give it to ministers, but there need to be really sensible reasons as to why that should be, and there simply aren't in this case. I will give way.
And I've been following his arguments closely. It is certainly the case, with or without wisdom, this House is capable of making poor decisions. And I've been here, voted for them occasionally, voted against them, and made poor decisions. But it is much more likely that this House will get it right rather than in a statutory instrument, in a delegated legislation committee, where a minister comes along and reads out a brief which she or he often don't understand under questioning, if indeed questioning happens. So, and the argument for this bill, as it's been put forward, is really speed and capacity. We don't meet on Thursdays. We often don't vote on... Sorry, we don't meet to vote on Thursdays. We often meet on Mondays. There's plenty of time for this House to do it.
Entirely agree. And since the general election, I did an analysis. 48.3% of sitting days have been one-line whips. So there is no argument for the government to assert that we don't have time in order to put forward fresh legislation. It simply isn't the case. They don't have a legislative agenda which they're progressing with any urgency. There's plenty of room. If we need to regulate, we can do it. So we've got a big decision to take here as parliamentarians. We're being asked by the government to nod through a blank cheque which is in breach of our parliamentary conventions. It's against the express advice of the cross-party Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And I say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that any parliamentarian worthy of the name will vote against this bill tonight.
Lawrence Turner.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As has been said, on the face of it, this is a short bill, but when we look beneath the surface, it is even more exciting than the bare heading of product regulation and metrology suggests. And most of us go through our days without giving much thought to the measurements of the units that govern our everyday lives, and I confess up till very recently to being one of them. But so many of our scientific and medical advancements succeeded or failed upon the most precise margins, as my honourable friend, the member for Erewash, so brilliantly set out. It was a real privilege to be in a chamber to listen to his speech. And in the city of Birmingham, best known throughout much of its history as the workshop of the world, many millions of hours must have been sweated out to exact the finest of measurements and tolerances, and I suspect that my humble friend is capable of accurately estimating just how many hours that would have taken. In fact, I note in passing that one of just 2 remaining proofing houses, which fell under the scope of the Gun Barrel Proof Act 1868 and succeeding acts, which attracted a lot of attention in the other place, is in Digbeth in the city of Birmingham. And in fact, at the start of this speech, we heard a question about when exactly the word metrology entered the common parlance, and I don't know exactly what date that was. But I do note that when the National Physical Laboratory was created in 1900, it was established with a metrological division, and one of the early guiding forces, Mr. J.E. Sears, later found a second career in a scales manufacturer, again in that good city of Birmingham. And today, when manufacturing jobs are starting to return to my constituency 20 years on from the collapse of MG Rover in pharmaceutical manufacturing, I do know some of the exacting standards that those manufacturers must meet. So we do only need to look at the number of Weights and Measures Acts that this House has carried down the years to understand the importance of these questions for our role as legislators. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I fear that I'm about to commit an unwise act by referencing the Magna Carta in this place, given that that text has been the subject of one or two interesting emails, which I suspect a number of honourable members have also received. But it is telling that that Act stipulated that there is to be a single measure for wine throughout our realm, and a single measure for ale, and a single measure for corn, and it shall be the same for weights as for measures. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the other place, the arguments over this bill, and I think it's fair to say in this debate as well, have come down to a simple point. Are delegated powers and statutory instruments the right process for adapting to a rapidly changing landscape for product safety and international measurement standards? I think it is worth remembering two things. First, that the theory that we could make sufficient updates through primary legislation can be tested against the history of legislation in this place. And indeed, some of the provisions in the Consumer Protection Act 1987 have been overtaken by events, and it has proved hard in practice to bring forward necessary changes to that legislation. And secondly, as has been said already, this work was initiated by the last government, and at the time they made the case for delegated powers persuasively. As the 2021 response to the 2019 call for evidence stated, over time, the limited powers we retained in domestic legislation became less effective. Rather than update these, the UK relied on powers in the European Communities Act 1972 to introduce new harmonised legislation to deal with product safety and metrology, and those powers have now expired. Governments of all colours must deal with, and again I quote, a complex, forever-changing landscape, and current legislation does not allow for many of the changes necessary to keep pace with technological advances and modern hazards. And I think a good example of the ever-changing metrological field can be drawn from the 2019 changes to the International System of Quantities, which altered in very subtle ways the definition of the kilogram, the amp, the Kelvin and the mole, with implications across a very wide range of regulations. And I think it is sensible to update those definitions swiftly by regulations. And we have heard examples of some of the unsafe products which are on sale at the moment, and I think it is worth noting that this bill is not simply about definitions, it is about enforcement as well, and clause 3 of this bill I think will enable some of those stretched resources which my honourable friend for Stoke-on-Trent Central referred to go further. And I do note as well that through the Transport Select Committee, we've received representations from Brompton Bikes, a very good British manufacturing success story, who have said that UK product safety regulations and enforcement have failed to keep pace with the development of e-bike technology. Unsafe, poor quality e-bike products are entering the hands of UK consumers with sometimes devastating consequences.
And on that point.
I will give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think my honourable friend is making an excellent point, and there are many constituents of ours around the country who will appreciate the specific points he makes about the changing product environment and the way that product design and development is moving very quickly. I have a large number of residents who are concerned about e-bikes, particularly being ridden irresponsibly, homemade kits attached to bicycles, cyclists speeding at great pace, often on pavements as well, and it's an interesting example of how this could be very effective. So I thank him for his work on that.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I know that this was one of the areas that he paid a lot of attention to in the transport brief, and I'm sure that as the committee continues to look into this area, we will be building on this work. And as he says, this is an issue that comes up time and time again in my constituency. We might not ever be able to get every single one of these vehicles off the road, but we do need the powers to bring more of them off our streets where they pose a threat to people's safety. And to illustrate, I think, the seriousness of the challenges that the government faces and the need for sometimes very swift progress, I do think that we need to only look to the scale of technological advancements in the field of hybrid warfare and the implications of those advancements for dual-use civilian technologies. I note that subsection 1.4d draws specific attention to products that can cause or be susceptible to electromagnetic disturbance. Madam Deputy Speaker, in Ukraine, the two adversaries are locked into a cycle of innovation and reaction in drone warfare and electronic countermeasures that are escalating at a blinding speed. Some of those developments do have implications for the potential misuse of civilian drones in this country, and I think that to suggest that primary legislation is capable of keeping pace is not, I think, realistic. Similarly, in respect of intangible products, again an issue that the House of Lords spent a large amount of welcome scrutiny time on, there is a case that primary legislation cannot cover enough eventualities in good time, especially in the age of artificially generated code. And I think back to the Volkswagen emission scandal 10 years ago, when so-called defeat devices were intangible in nature. I'll be glad to give way.
Honourable gentleman, I'm really grateful to him. It's a brilliant speech, and he's focused on some of the key issues in some ways that not every speech has. He's making a powerful case, but why does he think those arguments have not persuaded, in 3 different attempts and 3 different reports, the cross-party delegated regulation committee who provide expert insight into precisely legislation like this?
Well, I thank him for his intervention, although I don't agree with his characterisation of the speeches that we've heard today. And I think that honourable members have brought a wide range of perspectives, and even though there has been some disagreement across the House, and indeed on occasion within particular benches, all members have made their points sincerely. Now, I've read the reports that he references and the Minister's evidence. My reading of that report is that the committee held a very strong view on the principle of skeleton delegated legislation. But the point that the committee made in that report is that the case must be made for the use of such powers. And my view is that the case has been made because of the seriousness of the matters that we are discussing. He may, of course, do. I'll give way one more time.
I thank you very much for giving way. I just refer him to the conclusions of the 3rd report by the expert committee, where he says, "We remain of the view that the government has failed to provide a convincing justification for the inclusion of skeleton clauses in this bill that give ministers such wide powers to rewrite in regulations the substance of the regulatory regimes for products and metrology." So he's wrong in his assessment, isn't he?
No, with respect, I think the honourable member has misunderstood my point. My point is that the committee has every right to express that view. We also have the right to express our view as legislators in this place about whether the case has been made. And as I say, I think the case has been made that primary legislation is not a sufficient vehicle. And I will just say to the honourable member as well, that there are numerous precedents under the Health and Safety at Work Act, for example, for regulating dangerous products. The difference is that primary legislation does not cover all the eventualities for products of the kind that we are discussing today. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, I would like to finish by talking about the pint. And I note in passing that the first legislation that clearly regulated the pint, the Act for Ascertaining the Measures for Retailing Ale and Beer of 1698, did not see it necessary to define the actual quantity, so that was perhaps left to the royal prerogative to define. But the history books do clearly show that the pint is safe, so to speak, in Labour's hands. The noble Baron Donahue, in his memoir of his time at the head of the No. 10 Policy Unit, details how Harold Wilson intervened to save v Pint, and it was the Labour government in 2008 that secured the metric opt-out, but preserved the inch, the troy ounce, and, of course, the pint. So I know that honourable members opposite have spent a lot of time chasing away phantoms on this particular issue. I hope that they feel that it was a good use of their time and that we see more of it in this Parliament. But for our side of the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, I look forward to following the progress of this important bill, voting for it tonight, and perhaps also to raising a pint, or, as subclause 5.5 has it, 0.56826125 cubic decimetres to the bill's good health as it completes its remaining stages in this House.
Jim Alistair.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Forgive me for bringing the Commons back to what's the purpose of Parliament. The historic purpose of Parliament is to make the laws for our constituents and to hold the executive to account. And that is the fundamental that has been loosened by this bill. Because this bill, though it's entirely skeletal in form, but its effect is very far-reaching indeed. And it is quite obvious that it has a very clear purpose. And that purpose is to align on goods Great Britain with the EU single market on goods. If it were not so, then you wouldn't have clause 2.7, because the standard that is set in clause 2.7 is the EU standard. If this was a bill just about creating the opportunity to make regulations because there's a regulatory gap, then it wouldn't be tethered to the EU provisions on goods. It would be open-ended and free to make the choice that best suited. But the giveaway clause in this bill is 2.7. That lets the cat out of the bag, as indeed did the member for Walthamstow when she quite clearly indicated that that was the direction of travel that she sought. So that is the purpose. And then when you look at clause 1.2, again we have the open affirmation of the desire to make the compliance with relevant EU law. So it is abundantly clear that this is a creation that to realign us with EU law. The intent is that without voters noticing, to create this vehicle for realignment. And of course, realignment with laws that we don't make, that we can't change, because they're made by a foreign parliament. And that is the ambition in this act, in this bill, in respect of clause 2.7. To disenfranchise, as has happened already in Northern Ireland, by our subjugation to the EU single market and all of its rules, to disenfranchise the people of the United Kingdom so that in their entirety, at the government's whim, they can be subjected to laws they don't make and can't change. And that, of course, then inextricably ties us to the European Court of Justice, because it is the European Court of Justice that mediates, deliberates upon those laws that this bill wishes to tie us to. So it is an attempt to tie us not just to the EU single market, but to the court that rules the EU's single market. Now, sure, I'll give him.
In terms of the point that the honourable gentleman is making about franchisement and the fact that he wishes this Parliament to be able to be in control of the powers that it has, would he agree with me that it would be sensible for the UK Government to ensure that where powers are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, for example, that they are seeking consent from Scottish ministers rather than just legislating? Because the bill currently, as written, allows government ministers here to legislate in areas of devolved competency much as he's making the case that the EU court would be allowed to do.
Yes, one of the critical things about this bill is, under the Sewell Convention, it doesn't extend to secondary registration. It doesn't extend to statutory instruments. So this bill drives a coach and horses through the Sewell Convention as far as devolution is concerned, because it heaps all the powers into statutory instruments. Now, one might expect such a bold move to realign the United Kingdom with EU law to be an upfront legislation. I don't think that's too much to ask, that it should be there, plain and clear for all to see. Instead, it is to be conveyed in these statutory instruments. And statutory instruments, as we know, are those which frankly pass through, in the main, unnoticed. We've all been to delegated registration committees. We know they are farcical in that the Minister comes in with a brief which is simply rigidly read and all nodding members nod it through. So it is a farcical way to make legislation of any sort. Yes?
A lot of the debate has been about this clause and whether or not this bill leads us to a dynamic alignment. The government's position is that it doesn't, and this is also a mirage, a fantasy. If that's the case, does the member agree that a simple amendment to this bill to make that clear on the face of it would go a long way to reassuring members?
Absolutely. If the government is not, as many of us suspect, following a deliberate approach of circumventing debate in this House on key realignment issues and is seeking rather to channel it through statutory instruments, then call our bluff, change this bill on the face of it in that regard. But this idea of skeleton legislation, which sets up the powers being taken from Parliament and given to the executive, is something which historically the party of government railed against. Indeed, within a week of the second reading in the other place of this bill, the current Attorney General gave the Bingham lecture. This is what he said. Excessive reliance on delegated powers, Henry VIII clauses, or skeleton legislation upsets the proper balance between Parliament and the executive. This not only strikes at the rule of law values, but also at the cardinal principles of accessibility and legal certainty. In my view, the new government offers an opportunity for a reset in the way that government thinks about these issues. This means in particular a much sharper focus on whether taking delegated powers is justified in a given case, and more careful consideration of the appropriate safeguards. Where did that go to? That was the Attorney General. Yes, I'll go back.
Well, I'm interested in the Attorney General's view, and we should take that seriously. Doesn't the Honourable Gentleman recognise that primary legislation in this place metamorphosises in its passage through scrutiny? I've been involved in many bills as a Shadow Minister, a Minister and a backbencher, and that's precisely what happens. Ministers listen to argument, and as bills return to the House, they reflect the argument both from here and in the Lords. Secondary legislation just doesn't go through that process, which is why it's so important that bills we pass here don't contain the kind of permissive powers that facilitate so much secondary legislation.
The right honourable member is absolutely right. And if you were wanting to realign the United Kingdom with the EU, then the easiest passage is statutory instruments, and that is why that is the chosen mechanism here. One final point I want to make. This Parliament, traditionally and properly, makes the law on criminal offences. We set the tariffs, we say sometimes what the minimum, but always what the maximum penalty is on a criminal offence. We say what is the content, what is the actus reus and the mens rea of the criminal offence. But amazingly, under this bill, clauses 3, 9 and 11, 6, 9 and 11, we are going to make criminal offences by statutory instrument. Now, surely we've lost the run of ourselves if we think it is appropriate to make criminal offences in that essentially uncontrolled manner. It deprives this House, and therefore those we represent, of the very careful scrutiny that should always go into making something a crime. And that is but another of the fundamental flaws of this undeserving bill.
Dr. Prinsley, I'm told your speech is just a few minutes long, so I will hope you honour that. Dr. Prinsley?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I welcome this bill, which will address the alarming proliferation of unsafe products in online marketplaces. And I'd like to talk particularly about the hazards of unsafe toys increasingly being sold online. Now, as a very recently retired ENT surgeon, actually yesterday, I know the very real harm that these dangerous toys cause. I have operated on cases of young children who inhaled small components from unsafe toys, detachable parts, unsafely secured, and a choking hazard, ribbon or string exceeding the legal limits, creating strangulation hazards, frightening, life-threatening situations that no family should have to put up with. These aren't isolated incidents. Which investigation found that over 90% of toys purchased from some online marketplaces unfit for sale in the UK. Shockingly, these toys falsely displayed UK and European safety marks, misleading parents into believing that they're buying something safe for their children. And the tragedy is that many of these cases the sellers simply disappear, vanishing from the platform, families left with no way to seek redress from the harm caused, which is why we must act. And I'm glad that this bill will give the government the opportunity to address this. It will give the government power to regulate new and emerging business models, marketplaces which previous laws did not allow.
On that point, the Honourable Member, if I...
Certainly.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. So, lithium-ion batteries are essential for achieving our net zero goals, but as demand grows for products containing such batteries, we need to do more to protect consumers against these dangerous standard lithium-ion batteries. And since 2020, e-bikes and e-scooterifiers have caught...
It's an intervention, not a speech.
Oh. Does my right honourable friend agree with me there should be a mechanism to recognise high-risk products so we can regulate and protect consumers?
I thank the member for her intervention, and I would like to point out the danger of button batteries, particularly which cause perforation of the esophagus and the trachea by a chemical reaction, something well known to ENT surgeons. Now, 95% of consumers have purchased from online platforms in the last 2 years, with approximately 23 million monthly UK transactions. And we certainly need strong accountability for these marketplaces, and without this, dangerous items will continue to resurface, putting children at risk. So I urge the House to ensure this bill puts more pressure on the sellers of these unsafe toys, forcing them to take responsibility for their actions. Thank you.
An honourable man. Graham Stewart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate, and we've had excellent speeches across the House. The Honourable Member for Erewash, I think the whole House was agreed on the brilliance of his speech. We've had great speeches, I would say perhaps, but particularly I think on this side of the House. The Honourable Member for Broadland and Fakenham, the Honourable Member for North Antrim and East Antrim, getting to the heart and the nub of the critique of this bill. Whereas we've had many speeches, including the last one, which are good speeches about issues of product safety, about the need to have a system that keeps up and matches it. And I think the one that addressed both that issue and the issue of whether this legislation is appropriate was what I thought was the outstanding speech on the other side from the member for Birmingham Northfield. He didn't like my praise of his speech insofar as it disparaged in any way anybody else's. But I just think he did face up directly, not just to saying, oh, well, there are these problems with products and product safety, and here's a bill that could do something about it. He actually dealt with the fact that this bill gives enormous power to ministers. And of course, as colleagues across the House have pointed out, the purpose of this Honourable House, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to hold the feet to the fire, hold to account, to hold in check the executive and make sure that we champion the will of the people who sent us here. And as has been referred to already, not only the minister on the bench opposite, but of course the Right Honourable Member for Stalybridge and Hyde warned this House back in 2018, and I quote, that the use of delegated powers carries a risk of abuse by the executive. And speeches such as that were given by the Honourable Member for Walthamstow, who seemed to suffer a form. She's not here, so I'll try and be more polite than I would have been if she was. But I do think, I think the Brexit derangement syndrome, if it is a condition, is one that affects people not only who are sort of maniacally in favour of Brexit, but equally those who seem unable to think rationally from the other side. And the point I tried to make to her in an intervention I would make again is that giving such untrammelled power to ministers is frightening, I would suggest, regardless of what you prefer. Closer alignment with the EU, as she said, we need common sense alignment, but these powers would allow a super ideological future minister to come in and seek entirely for ideological reasons to stop having any alignment with the most sensible of EU regulations purely in order to have some Brexit difference. And that makes no sense whatsoever. The Honourable Lady will forgive me if I won't. I'm going to press on a little, but I may come to the Honourable Lady. And I understand that following the loveless landslide that brought this government to power, it has, and the Honourable Members themselves have done an about-face. So, you know, they now delight in more powers to the executive. So much so that in its very first paragraph, Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill gives the same Right Honourable Member I just referenced the power to make regulations anywhere in the UK without consulting Parliament in Westminster, Holyrood, Cardiff Bay or Stormont on more or less anything he likes. Anything he likes. And I'm so pleased that the Honourable Member behind me raised the devolution question, because I was a minister for 8 years, such is the complexity of the devolution settlement now, that even with thousands of civil servants working on primary legislation, you come to the House and suddenly it gets pointed out that you are in breach of the Sewell Convention. You are ignoring the fact that Northern Ireland has a slightly different environmental regulatory environment or energy environment than does Scotland or Wales. And you find out that it's more complex than you first thought. But now we're giving powers to ministers who won't have to go through any of that rigmarole. They won't get to find out how they are trampling on the devolution settlement. And it's a serious issue. But we, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this side of the House, we're unable, apart from to make these arguments. It really is about trying to engage members opposite and trying to get them to recognise they're not just here to back the government, and that these, they need to question not whether these powers could be used for good. And the member for Birmingham Northfield, I thought, gave a brilliant speech on and gave some more examples of ways in which the speeding up of, it was he who talked about the drones in Ukraine, just the pace of technological change means that perhaps, while we on this side maintain that for the most part the system that we've had worked perfectly well, he made the case that we perhaps need something quick, more speedy going forward. And I can see he made a strong argument. But nonetheless, is this the answer, which is just to hand to ministers, this entire skeleton bill, all the powers in the world? And I would suggest it isn't. And I really hope, and I know the Minister and the Secretary of State are decent people, and I hope that we may see, as this the legislation proceeds through this House, ways of curbing some of these powers, while nonetheless allowing us to have a regulatory system which can speedily respond to inappropriate product. None of us want to see that happen, and none of us want to see some parliamentary pride getting in the way of an effective system. We've got to find a way of making things work. But this has gone too far the other way. And I would repeat, that's what you have the experts, cross-party, on the delegated regulation committee looking at it and saying they don't feel that the case has been made to justify such massive powers. Some parallels are made, again, by the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow, and I think it's fair enough to say, well, look at the way that King Henry VIII powers and delegated powers were taken by the government in the last Parliament. But that was in order to implement, they were quite rightly, people questioned it, but that was about implementing Brexit. It really was something that was enormous and had to be done at a reasonable speed. But those of us involved were cognizant of the fact that we didn't want it to set a precedent. We don't want government to take the unique conditions of implementing Brexit and take it as a new way of governing, because that really would be, to go to the Honourable Member for Erewash's comment about rebuilding the world that the ancient Egyptians had. Well, they're very good on centralising authority, and I don't think that's an entirely good thing. And that's exactly what this bill does, so I agree with him on that. The Secretary of State, I'm sure, is an excellent judge on things like the safe operation of a laptop, say, for a trainee solicitor, who knows. But he would now have the power to regulate any product for sale in the UK on the basis of safety or functionality. Any product. And the immense power, Madam Deputy Speaker, given to the Secretary of State will allow him to decide what is and isn't sold in the UK without consulting this place, merely providing a written statement. And it goes further. Ministers acquire the power to give inspectors, and this is something I would hope all parliamentarians would reflect on, the right to enter somebody's home to seize any product the minister has decided on the basis of non-compliance. Oh, and Madam Deputy Speaker, this can be imposed on manufacturers, marketers, installers, importers, or people who run an online marketplace, the definition of which, by the way, can be altered at ministerial whim at any moment. So we've heard about dangerous and often unpopular electric bikes and scooters, but the powers in this bill allow the Secretary, a future Secretary of State, and we've had some eccentric ones in the past, could decide to ban bicycles because he considers them to be dangerous. You might look at the figures on it. After publishing a statement, he can instruct anyone he likes to enter the house of every bike owner, to enter every bike shop, and seize every bike in the United Kingdom. Now, the Secretary of State could effectively end cycling in the UK without coming to Parliament, could create legions of cycle inspectors who can enter people's homes or businesses and seize their property before disposing of them. And the government wants to hide this act under the innocuous name of the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill. It is a massive power given to the Secretary of State. And I know there are many new members opposite, but I'm not very keen on any government, even the one of which I was a member. Governments do have, well, it was Lord Acton, wasn't he, said that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, there's an element of sort of absolute power in this bill. But we have an opportunity both to recognise the powerful case made by the member for Birmingham Northfield to have an appropriate system, and his colleagues talking about different challenges, but make sure that we, in the process of going through this House, that we limit and reduce those powers, because I know my cycle analogy, if you like, or example, is a little extreme, but it's also true. It wouldn't require any return to this House, and that would be able to do it. The Prime Minister, of course, told us that the number one mission of this government is growth. Yet, of course, his ministers, not satisfied with taking the fastest growing economy in the entire G7 and bringing it to a shuddering halt, have introduced what may be the most tediously named but potentially dangerous bill in the history of this Parliament. And we can look at what the government has done for business so far. Ended the rate relief for hospitality, made part-time workers too expensive to hire, hiked the cost of employing people through next week's jobs tax, strengthened the trade unions and made it impossible to fire new workers. But this bill, in some ways, in a crowded field, I wouldn't want to exaggerate its role, but it does, in many ways, take the biscuit. Businesses are struggling to cope with all these things already, and now we have greater business uncertainty caused by the fact that ministers can, at a whim, choose which products can and cannot be sold, providing the exact opposite of the certainty which members opposite suggested this bill could bring, in a way that I think has no logic behind it. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful for him allowing an intervention. That infamous list that he just went through, every single one of those required a vote in this House, and that the members opposite had to put their name to that proposed legislative change. They don't under this, do they?
They don't. And the Secretary of State, not the current wonderful, benign and insightful and genial Secretary of State, but a future rather less palatable one, can wake up one day and impose new regulations on business and effectively strangle and bring red tape to business in the land. And remember how close we were in 2017 to having a government which I think would be very different to the one that's opposite us today, or indeed that the Conservatives did. So why are the government doing this? Well, I can't look into a man's soul, but I have an idea, because Labour spent years fighting the UK's attempts to remove the burden of regulation on business after we left the EU. I won't give way, I'm afraid. At every turn, the party opposite tried to cling to nurse rather than let business innovate and sell their goods. The government is seeking to undermine and erode the freedoms we have won over the last few years. And indeed, that is in black and white in the bill. The Secretary of State may impose EU law onto products. And again, without the requirement to come to this place and ask our permission to reimpose EU law on them. I'm not saying this is the worst thing the government has done. As I've already alluded to, there's quite a packed a list of those, from cutting the winter fuel duty for pensioners, the farm tax, the jobs tax, imposing stamp duty on first-time buyers, which comes in, I think, is it today? Suddenly, someone wants to buy a house, Madam Deputy Speaker. The hospitality tax, I could go on. But executive powers are at their most pernicious when they have no limits. And this legislation isn't about metrology or about the better regulation of products. It's about giving the government the power to do what it likes, when it likes, for reasons it doesn't have to explain, and then impose as it sees fit. And the fact that we might like and even trust the current Secretary of State is no reason to give ministers, about whom we know nothing now, powers like this, and I hope that members opposite will join us in opposing this bill.
Hello, Minister Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And this has been a genuinely important, interesting and lively debate on the subject of product regulation and metrology. Because it's also been a debate about the balance of power between the executive and us here in Parliament. The UK product safety and metrology framework is derived from European Union law, and it developed while the UK was a member of the European Union, when we didn't have the opportunity here to address product safety as rapidly as we do now in our changing world. And following our departure from the European Union, the UK established its independent regulatory system, which must be flexible enough to accommodate emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and address changes in consumer purchasing behaviours. As the explanatory notes of this bill state, the purpose of the bill is to ensure the UK is better equipped to tackle modern safety challenges, safeguard consumers, seize opportunities for economic growth, and so on. Now, the Secretary of State said earlier in his introductory remarks that this bill was introduced in the previous Parliament. And I want to emphasise that it was not. And I want to offer the Minister the chance to correct the record in his closing remarks in case the House has been inadvertently misled. However, upon leaving the European Union, the UK created the UK Conformity Assessed Marking, known as the UKCA, to replace the Conformité Européenne marking, also known as CE, the markings which manufacturers use to demonstrate product conformity. The UK still recognises CE markings.
However, the EU does not recognise the UK conformity assessment. So can the Minister confirm that in his discussions and resetting of discussions in terms of trade with the European Union, that discussions are happening to ensure that UK CA markings and any products regulated here in the UK are mutually recognised? Turning to the points that have been raised in today's excellent debate, we heard fantastic speeches from my honourable friends, the member for Beaconsfield, the member for South Holland and the Deepings, the member for Broadland and Fakenham, and the member for Beverley and Holderness. And we also heard some very powerful voices from Northern Ireland, benches adjacent East Antrim and North Antrim, and also the expertise that the Honourable Member for Wokingham brings from his background in the toy industry. From the benches opposite, we heard impassioned speeches, often about product safety from the member from Worsley and Eccles, Bathgate and Linlithgow, the member for Walthamstow, who described us as sinners repenting, which I hasten to surmise, Madam Deputy Speaker, might mean that she is a repenter who is beginning to sin. And we heard from the Stoke-on-Trent Central member, who is passionate advocate for the ceramics from his constituency. And then, in an absolute masterclass, Madam Deputy Speaker, we had the pleasure of hearing from Parliament's first metrologist the ancient history of metrology in a very, very enjoyable speech, and speeches from the member for Birmingham Northfield and Bury St Edmunds. But before embarking on the reason why we are opposing this bill tonight, I would like to welcome the government's U-turn in the other place on its plans to rule over the size of the Great British Pint, or as the member for Erewash would describe it, the 0.568 to 6125 cubic decimetre. And although they were initially resistant, ministers eventually recognised that our Great British Pint should remain untouched. But I'm afraid that's all I can welcome about this piece of legislation, because we on this side of the House are deeply concerned with the government's overreach and excessive reliance on delegated powers within this bill. Henry VIII would be absolutely delighted by this piece of legislation. The benches opposite claim that this will simplify our regulatory framework, yet all we see is the undermining of our sovereignty and of the powers of Parliament. This 15-page bill would give the Secretary of State unchecked powers to amend product safety regulations, change the definition of an online marketplace, introduce new penalties, inspection powers and charges on businesses, driving up the already soaring costs of doing business in the UK. Or, as many of my honourable friends have mentioned in this debate, grant sweeping powers to the government to potentially make us a passive recipient of laws made in Brussels. And while international trade and cooperation is welcome, this is not what over 17 million people voted for in 2016 when we took back control. This is a betrayal of Brexit. This bill is not purely a technical bill. Part of its purpose is to allow dynamic environment of goods with the EU single market laws, giving the EU power to rule on standards for manufactured goods that we produce here in the United Kingdom. The EU Trojan horse bill could see us readopting a regulatory regime over which we have no influence, impact or sanction, leaving us as the rule takers and not the rule makers. It is fundamentally not good practice or good governance to deliver substantial changes through delegated legislation. And I'm going to quote here, Madam Deputy Speaker, "We must bear in mind that the use of delegated powers carries a risk of abuse by the executive, which is not something the opposition could ever support. Rather, it is our duty at this stage to check the powers of the executive and ensure that we are not giving them carte blanche to change the balance of power permanently in their favour." These are not my words, Madam Deputy Speaker. These are the words of the Secretary of State, the member for Stalybridge and Hyde. Tomorrow, we could see tariffs imposed on us by the United States. it is paramount that we secure a mutually beneficial UK-US trade deal as soon as possible. However, I cannot see how this bill, which drags us closer to the European Union, would give the United States any incentive to work with us. So, in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Minister a few questions? Can he confirm what the limits will be on ministerial powers? And what oversight will Parliament have in respect to regulatory changes made under this bill? What consultation will occur on change with the real-world businesses that are affected by it? And will he confirm that no regulations made under the bill will prevent or impede UK businesses from trading internationally? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill undermines Parliament and risks tying British businesses to EU red tape in which we have no say. We cannot allow these excessive powers to create further uncertainty among British businesses of all sizes who are already facing the soaring costs of doing business due to the Chancellor's tax grab. This bill is a parliamentary sovereignty sellout. We got Brexit done, let's keep it that way. This is a bill that gives away control, and that is why I call upon the House this evening to back our amendment to stop the bill.
Yeah. I call the Minister Justin Madden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank Right Honourable members across the House for what has been an interesting and at times informed debate on the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said in his opening speech, the primary mission of this government is economic growth, to help rejuvenate our high streets and to promote innovation. And this legislation is an important element in this drive and will further cement the UK as a world leader in product regulation and safety. The legislation will have real-world impacts which we can all relate to. As we've heard today, product safety failures can have devastating consequences, and we are determined that our regulatory framework is as agile and flexible as possible in its response both to new threats and complex modern supply chains, but without stifling innovation. So there's been an awful lot of contributions today, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll try and cover as many as I can in my comments. I think, first of all, I think it's really appropriate that I start by referencing my honourable friend, the member for Erewash's speech, an excellent speech that lighted up the whole House. He is, of course, the first meteorologist to have spoken in this chamber, metrologist, and he may well be coming back in the Bill Committee, because I think he has definitely talked his way onto that with his absolute insight into this issue. And indeed, my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Northfield, almost matched him in terms of technical specificity, but his historical knowledge was also very important. I know he's just finished their Bill Committee with me, Madam Deputy Speaker, but he's talking his way onto this one as well. Perhaps I shouldn't say that, Madam Deputy Speaker, but may encourage colleagues not to speak in future debates. My honourable friend, the member for Bathgate and Linlithgow, and the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, and indeed a number of other members talked about the issue of e-bikes, which is a real concern, and I'm sure the whole House will have been moved by the tragic cases of e-bike fires that we too often hear about. My honourable friend, the Secretary of State, referred to Sofia Duarte and her tragic death in his opening comments, and I met with her mother last year to talk about what we can do with this bill to prevent tragedies like that's happening again. In the wake of the increasing number of incidents around fires associated with e-bikes and lithium-ion batteries, there have been a number of calls from businesses, trade associations, consumer groups and parliamentarians to tighten up the law, and this legislation will allow us to ensure the UK's product safety framework can keep up with technological developments, including on e-bikes. The powers in this bill will allow us to update regulations to ensure the best protections for consumers and consistency with the majority of reputable retailers. The government is currently considering how best it could use the powers in the bill to regulate these products in an efficient and proportionate way, and in particular to ensure that products that can pose a greater risk, such as lithium-ion batteries in e-bikes and scooters, are indeed safe. This includes bringing forward powers in the bill to better define online marketplaces and confer additional duties on them to help the sale of unsafe products, including converter kits. And as my honourable friend, the member for Worsley and Eccles, pointed out, this is a fast-moving environment, and the bill will give us the flexibility to tackle that. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Would he agree that if a UK manufacturer wants to produce a product for the UK market, they should produce it to UK regulations? If they want to export it to Europe, is it not sensible to produce that product to the UK regulations, which will open up a massive market on our doorstep? So keeping up with EU regulations will generally be good for the British business economy and help with economic growth.
Minister.
Well, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, I think, tempts me to set out a statement of policy, which this bill is not intended to do. We want to give ourselves maximum flexibility in terms of moving forward and be able to deal with issues agilely as they arise. I will refer to the comments he made about online marketplaces in his contribution. Indeed, the comments made by my own friend, the member for Bury, Edmonton Stoke Market, who talked about unsafe toys and button batteries, and the fact that some investigations have discovered up to 90% of those products purchased on online marketplaces were unsafe, because the bill does recognise that online marketplaces are in desperate need of regulation. It will give us powers to clarify and modernise responsibilities for online marketplaces in a flexible and proportionate way to protect consumers and create a fair playing field for law-abiding businesses. It will enable the government to modernise the responsibilities of online supply chain actors. While the growth of e-commerce has provided consumers with greater choice and convenience, it cannot be at the expense of consumer safety. So we will continue to engage with consumer groups, businesses and online marketplaces in the development of specific online marketplace requirements to ensure that they are proportionate and to mitigate any costs to consumers. I can also confirm it is the intention of the government to consult on the duties for online marketplaces soon after royal assent and to bring forward subsequent regulations as soon as is practically possible. Turning now to the contribution from my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central. He spoke with his customary passion about the ceramics industry in the potteries, and I acknowledge his ideas and his suggestion to protect his industry. I'm not sure whether this bill is just quite right the vehicle for his suggestion, but I will take it away and come back to him on that particular point. I think now it's probably worth talking about the issue that seems to vex members on the opposition benches rather a lot, which is about whether this is some way a reset into EU laws by the back door. It is about domestic regulation, and we're not rejoining the EU by the back door. This is about giving us flexibility to ensure product regulation now and in the future, which is tailored to the needs of the UK. And of course there will be some instances where we want to take a similar approach to the EU, but there will be other times when we want to take our own approach. These decisions will be taken on a case-by-case basis in the best interest of UK businesses and consumers. So, as my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, referred to, the Retained EU Law Act was a bill which gave significant powers to the executive, and I think that the Liberal Democrat spokesperson quoted me in respect of that bill. That Act, in fact, reformed 7,000 regulations across every range of society, every function. It was a far broader bill than this, and indeed the DPRRC called it hyper-skeletal, which is some way beyond the criticisms they levelled against this bill. I'll now turn to the reasoned amendment tabled by the official opposition. I think it's worth restating that this bill is not about rejoining the EU. I think that David Cameron's comments that he wanted the Conservative Party to stop banging on about Europe have some way to reach fruition, despite the fact that we left 5 years ago. This bill gives us the necessary powers to make sure product regulation now and in the future meets the interests of the UK. The powers that we are seeking in the bill will be used solely and exclusively in the best interests of UK businesses and consumers. I recognise that the House of Lords Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee raised concerns about this being a skeleton bill, but the government considered those concerns and the other representations made by Lords in the other place. Our existing product regulations are necessary to keep consumers safe and provide clarity and a level playing field for businesses. They extend to many thousands of pages and cover a huge amount of technical detail. And as the noble and learned Lord Panic said in the other place, the practical reality is that technical regulations of the breadth and complexity that will be produced cannot sensibly be enacted by primary legislation. If we were required to use primary legislation every time we wanted to have a regulation in product safety, there will be little time for anything else. And of course, the opposition benches seem to have forgotten that actually, since the Consumer Protection Act in 1987, governments of all stripes have recognised the need to make product safety regulations by secondary legislation. I think since 1987, the Conservative Party has been in power for 24 years, so they have had more than enough time to actually deal with another way of dealing with product safety, but they haven't chosen to, because actually this is the pragmatic approach that we are taking. And we have taken note of some of the concerns about powers in this bill, because we've removed a number of Henry VIII powers, we've introduced a consultation requirement, we've added additional affirmative resolution procedures, and we've also published a code of conduct which sets out the controls that we will have to ensure regulations are proportionate and evidence-based. And I'm grateful for the other place for setting out some of their concerns. And the Shadow Minister did point out in her comments that they didn't introduce this bill in the last Parliament. I'm happy to confirm that that was the case, but that actually shows that there was a gap in the law that needed filling, and the Conservatives failed to act on it. And indeed, if we look at some of the important consumer groups in this country, such as Which, they've recognised that there's action needed on here. Sue Davis, Head of Consumer Protection Policy at Which, said it is encouraging that the government is prioritising a bill that should address the huge gap in consumer protections, which allows online marketplaces to facilitate the sale of unsafe and illegal products without facing repercussions. So we vote for the reasoned amendment today. We won't be having any of those protections, and I don't think any responsible party would be moving something along those lines. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will... Sorry, Mr Speaker, I see you've changed in the middle of my speech. This government is never going to compromise on safety. It's essential to strengthening the rules and regulations needed to protect consumers, businesses and the public, and I therefore commend this bill to the House.
Yeah. Order. The original question will the bill now be read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper, the question is the amendment be made. Does many of that opinion say aye? Aye! The contrary, no? No! Division, clear the lobbies. You ready for it? The question is the amendment be made. Does many of that opinion say aye? Aye. The contrary, no? No. For the ayes, we have Jeremiah Mayu and Rebecca Paul. For the noes, Christian Wakeford and Anna Turley. Order.
The ayes to the right, 110. The noes to the left, 302.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 110. The noes to the left, 302. The noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock! The question is that the bill now be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no.
No.
Division, clear the lobbies. Order, order. The question is the bill now be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no.
No.
The tellers for the ayes, Christian Wakeford, and the Turley for the noes, Jerome Mayo and Rebecca Paul.
Yeah.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 110.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 110. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock the doors. Right, the programme motion to be moved formally.
Beg to move.
Question is on the order paper. As amended, that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Money motion to be moved formally.
Beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it.